Good morning, all. You are here at the New Jersey Offshore Wind Transmission State Agreement Approach third stakeholder meeting. I know I can see folks are trickling in, so I'll just give it a few minutes, but I wanted to welcome our initial attendees. Good morning. I'm going to give it a few more minutes. If you are here for the Offshore Wind Transmission State Agreement Approach, you're in the right place, as hopefully you can all see the initial slide. I see we are still gaining some participants. I'm going to give it a few more minutes, but your sound is working. I'm just on mute. So I'll welcome you guys and I'll check back in about a minute or so. Good morning. I'm going to give it 30 more seconds just to make sure we have our full team here. And we will get started shortly. All right, I have a little after 10, so I'm going to take the liberty and get started and welcome everybody to our third stakeholder meeting on New Jersey's state agreement approach. Today, we are going to be focusing on the environmental and permitting issues. So I do want to welcome everybody. It's obviously a very exciting process for us, and we're excited to be here. So with that, I'll introduce myself. My name is Andrea Hart. I am in legal and counsel's office here at the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. And I lead the board's state agreement approach efforts along with our tremendous support from staff, our deputy attorney generals, our consultant Brattle Group, and of course, we couldn't do this without PJM. We're here today regarding the exciting matter of the state agreement approach, and I'll provide the caption and docket number so it's handy for attendees. It's in the matter of declaring transmission to support offshore wind a public policy of the state of New Jersey, docket number Q020100630. I wanted to provide a few housekeeping updates to ensure today's meeting runs smoothly. Today, we are utilizing a virtual meeting, which was noticed by various means, including notices to the board's listservs and posting on the Board of New Jersey's website. Members of the public are invited to listen to the meeting and express their views on this matter. I do want to note that staff is really excited to hear and accept feedback at this point. I ask that all attendees update their Zoom handle to include their names and affiliated company if appropriate. Only those panelists who are presenting should have their videos on. All others will be asked to have their video off and will be muted. Since BPU will be controlling today's presentations, I'll ask that presenters just let us know when you want us to advance your slides. For the moderated discussion of our meeting today, I'll ask that the panelists keep their videos on. Please feel free to speak freely or raise your hand, whichever you feel is best and most conducive to the discussion. The meeting's agenda was circulated among registered attendees yesterday, or Friday. And this meeting is being recorded, and this recording will be made available on the board's website. The board is also accepting written and electronic comments. While all comments will be given equal consideration and be made part of the final record, the preferred method of transmittal is via the board's external access portal after obtaining a My New Jersey portal ID. Detailed instructions for e-filing can be found on the board's homepage at www.nj.gov/bpu/agenda/e-filing. Emailed comments may also be filed with the board secretary in PDF or Word format to board.secretary@bpu.nj.gov. Written comments may also be submitted to the board secretary at the Board of Public Utilities, 44 South Clinton Avenue, first floor, P.O. Box 350, Trenton, New Jersey, 08625-0350. All comments should include the name of the matter and the docket number. And please note, all comments are considered public documents for the purposes of the state's Open Public Records Act. Please identify any information that you seek to keep confidential by submitting in accordance with the confidentiality procedures set forth at NJAC 14:1-12.3. The deadline for comments on this matter is 5 p.m. on April 29th. You may pose questions into the Q&A feature, and if appropriate, the moderator will queue up the appropriate person to address the question. On behalf of the Board of Public Utilities, I appreciate your participation in this meeting. And with that, I'll begin today's meeting with a brief presentation on the state agreement approach. Slide. So the topic for today's meeting is exploring the potential impacts that the SAA projects may have on wildlife, recreational and commercial fisheries, and natural resources. And secondly, the potential issues with federal, state, and local permitting. So let's take a step back to see how we got here. And for those who have attended our previous sessions, this will be a good refresher. Slide. Governor Murphy set a goal of achieving 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind generation by 2035 via Executive Order 92. The board issued its first offshore wind solicitation in 2018 with an 1,100 megawatt award. And when issued, this solicitation was the largest in the country and represented a very large step in achieving the state's ambitious renewable energy goals. In 2020, the board issued a second solicitation, which resulted in 2 more offshore wind projects being awarded, totaling more than 2,600 megawatts. 3 more solicitations are scheduled to occur in order to meet the 7,500 megawatt goal. Next slide. So how do you deliver the electricity generated by offshore wind farms to New Jersey residents? Through an offshore wind transmission system, which simply means the delivery of electricity from the offshore wind turbines to the local distribution system onshore. Thus far, under the first 2 solicitations, each project proposed to bring the electricity onshore from their individual project. You can see how this may result in some inefficiencies, particularly as new wind farms are added. In New Jersey and other mid-Atlantic states, the transmission planning process is based on a detailed set of rules approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and implemented by the regional grid operator PJM interconnection. These rules determine how and when to expand and enhance the regional grid and outline a highly competitive, robust procurement structure to select which projects get built. To position the state to reach Governor Phil Murphy's ambitious goal of 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind energy by 2035, the board has formally requested inclusion of its offshore wind public policy into the regional transmission expansion analysis at PJM. This competitive solicitation process is affectionately known as the SAA, or the State Agreement Approach. Next slide. The SAA is a tool offered by PJM for its member states to request transmission development needs based on policy requirements that PJM will incorporate into the RTEP process. New Jersey is the first state to utilize the SAA. By initiating a competitive solicitation for transmission projects from a broad pool of regional developers, the board is ensuring that New Jersey can select from the most efficient and effective options available on the market in pursuit of a coordinated transmission solution for delivering offshore wind. PJM's robust competitive bidding process forces developers to propose lower cost and innovative proposals, resulting in efficiencies and ratepayer savings. Opening the proposal window to all qualified PJM developers allows for a diversity of approaches and expertise that identifies an optimal grid with high benefits and low environmental impact. Next slide. PJM with BPU staff developed a solicitation for electric transmission project applications under the SAA to meet New Jersey's public policy. That window opened on April 15th, 2021 and closed on September 17th, 2021. The solicitation requested applications for 4 distinct options shown on the next slide, with each entity having the choice to propose more than one option. PJM received applications from 13 entities proposing a total of 80 projects. Under the SAA, the BPU is the ultimate decision maker, deciding which, if any, of the proposals proceed to construction. These projects are not likely to be pursued if they do not result in development at a lower cost, lower risk, or higher benefit option for the interconnection and delivery of New Jersey's offshore wind. The BPU may decide to terminate the SAA process if it is in the best interest of the state. Board staff continues to work with PJM to develop adequate ratepayer protections should any transmission project eventually be selected through the SAA. Next slide. The SAA solicitation identifies 4 interrelated components of an open access offshore wind transmission facility that may be part of an optimal solution. The first component, option 1A, focuses on potential upgrades to the existing grid that may be necessary for offshore wind energy injection. Staff and PJM conducted an analysis prior to releasing the solicitation, which identified 4 default injection locations on the onshore grid for the interconnections of potential solutions. Developers retain flexibility to propose alternate interconnection locations if they identify more beneficial locations. The second component, option 1B, requests developers to submit proposals for extending the onshore transmission grid closer to the shore, creating a so-called power corridor. These corridors would serve to extend the onshore high voltage transmission system closer to the shoreline, providing planned landfall locations to optimize efficiency and minimize environmental disturbances. The third component, option 2, extends the power corridor concept into the water, providing a potential interconnection location for offshore wind that is closer to the turbines. The fourth component, option 3, requests developers to submit proposals for possible interconnections between offshore substations referred to as an offshore transmission backbone. This third proposal allows developers to demonstrate the benefit of a network grid that may connect various leased areas or other offshore wind transmission infrastructure. Under the SAA, the BPU is the ultimate decision maker, deciding which, if any, of the proposals proceed to construction. The projects that are not likely to be pursued if they do not result in development at a lower cost, lower risk, and higher benefit option for the interconnection and delivery of New Jersey's offshore wind. The BPU may terminate this process if it's determined to be in the best interest of the state. Next slide. Board staff is now evaluating those projects in close coordination with PJM, and the board may select the project or projects, or it might select no project at all. We are here to collectively and transparently guide the evaluation process. The board has engaged the professional consulting firm, the Brattle Group, through a competitive solicitation to assist us in this critical work and to help us facilitate a meaningful stakeholder involvement. The BPU team strongly invites and encourages your active participation and insight. With that, I'd like to introduce your moderator today, my colleague, Kira Lawrence. Kira is a climate scientist and oceanographer. She received her PhD from Brown and her master's degrees from Brown and UC Santa Cruz, and her underdegree from Dartmouth, all in earth sciences. She spent much of her career in academia, but has also worked at the Woodwell Climate Research Center. And with that, I'll kick it to Kira.
Thank you, Andrea. Good morning, everyone. Critical to the state agreement approach is a review process about how these potential projects will address environmental impacts and permitting. Next slide, please. So today our discussion is going to focus on the regulatory process, discuss impacts on natural resources, and explore the potential benefits of a coordinated approach in mitigating some of the core environmental concerns that are associated with offshore wind development. The SAA has the potential to help mitigate environmental impacts by minimizing the number of transmission cables, by reducing cable landfall impacts and overall transmission infrastructure. It also permits simultaneous evaluation of a variety of potential options for landfall routes, cable routes, infrastructure siting, and ties into existing infrastructure. This facilitates the ability to simultaneously weigh the environmental impacts of various proposals. Next slide, please. The location of SAA facilities will impact how future offshore wind generation projects interconnect to them and the associated environmental footprint with these facilities. In today's panel, we'll also explore how a coordinated approach affords insight into the cumulative impacts of offshore wind transmission. We invite stakeholders to provide their questions and feedbacks on these and other environmental and permitting topics that are related to the state agreement approach. If you're listening today and have a question about these matters, we invite you to type it into the Q&A. I look forward to our discussion and hearing feedback from stakeholders. We'll move on to the presentations now. Before I welcome our first speaker, I'll note that we'll have the presentations in succession, and there will be an opportunity to pose questions through the Q&A feature during the Q&A session that will follow the presentations. Now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Josh Gange, from the Office of Renewable Energy Programs at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Josh, thank you. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Kara. This is Josh Gange. As mentioned, I'm with BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and happy to give a brief overview of the offshore wind transmission framework. Next slide, please. So don't worry, I'm not actually going to read this slide. This is just the regulatory sites that grant BOEM the federal regulatory authority to grant leases and easements on the outer continental shelf. Next slide, please. So before I kind of get into our processes, I just wanted to note that there are many regulatory bodies that have quite a large role in this process. So it really does take quite a lot of coordination to make sure that everything is optimally done. From the federal government, this involves us as sort of the landlord, FERC as the overall grid operator and regulator, as well as the permitting agencies that might give permits for disturbance of the seafloor or for impacts to natural resources and environmental concerns. Obviously, in this process, the grid operator, PJM, is quite heavily involved as well, and I'll let them speak about that later, I'm sure. And I can't really overstate the importance of the state role in setting their goals in the legislation to allow for offshore wind through the offtake agreements and the interests in property and landfall connections. Next slide, thanks. So essentially there are two paths that we have for transmission. The first is transmission as part of an offshore wind lease. Any of our leases that we issue confer the right to one or more non-competitive project easements for transmission. And then the second option is the transmission under the right-of-way grant. This would allow the holder to install cables and associated facilities for transmission purposes specifically. So that both of these could be at play under New Jersey's process, whether we're talking about connecting a wind farm to a land-based point of interconnection or the installation of an offshore substation or backbone system that would be on the outer continental shelf. Next slide, please. So the first step is perhaps a bit more straightforward, and this is transmission as part of a lease. So The way this works is a lessee would negotiate with the state entity and utilities to determine appropriate landfall and grid connection points. There would also be a grid connection study done with the ISO. And it's important to note here that BOEM doesn't have jurisdiction over the landfall sites or the state waters. So when it is part of the lease, we are mainly concerned with the offshore component. So the way this is done is the lessee proposes their easement to get to that landfall point and to that point of interconnection, and that the details of what they're requesting are provided as part of our construction and operations plan, which is sort of the major step that describes the offshore wind project. This can be done as a straightforward, this is what we're proposing to do, or it can be done under a project design envelope, which would allow for more than one option to be considered. So the entirety of the project, even though we don't have jurisdiction over the land-based components, the entirety of any offshore wind lease project is analyzed under the NEPA process for potential environmental impacts. Next slide, please. Great, and then I would note that so I guess one final step in that process from the lease is that the easement is issued at COP approval. So there's plenty of time during that NEPA review process to analyze potential impacts and sort of optimize the exact route that's taken. The other step is the right-of-way grant process. Under our regulations, OXLA, the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, requires a competitive process unless BOEM determines there is not competitive interest. So the way this is done is we likely issue a request for competitive interest that solicits information about the project and also solicits information about the area proposed. So it's somewhat incumbent upon people asserting that there would be competitive interest to show why that's the case, why projects wouldn't be able to coexist. However, after that solicitation, if it comes back that there is a reason that there's competition, BOEM would utilize a competitive process to award the right-of-way grant, similar to the auctions that we use in our leasing process for use of those OCS areas. Once that, but BOEM also conducts an environmental analysis and assesses the multiple use conflicts that might exist prior to making a decision on whether to issue a right-of-way grant. So this is important because just because a right-of-way grant is requested, it doesn't mean BOEM is forced to issue that grant if there are reasons that it would not be in the public interest. So if there were extreme conflicts or something. Next slide, please. So let's say that we get through that process and we issue a right-of-way grant to install that cable or offshore backbone system. The grant holder then has 1 year period to do survey work and then submit a general activities plan or GAP. This details the exact project that they're hoping to install and the methods that they would be utilizing. So during that process, they're conducting survey work to identify any hazards, environmental issues, cultural resources, and ways to optimize that route to minimize and avoid impacts. This gap also triggers an additional NEPA process, likely an environmental impact statement, which analyzes all of the potential impacts from the project and involves consultations with other agencies for consultation on their authorities prior to any approval, an installation, or denial of the project. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the regional transmission option, so the backbone system that could potentially be part of this process, would likely be proposed under that right-of-way grant process that I just mentioned, or that I just kind of discussed. And BOEM, again, would analyze the impacts of any proposed system through that NEPA process. We're probably unlikely to require the use of an unbuilt system. However, a lessee proposing to use a regional transmission system could be granted an easement to that system. So this is sort of the combination of those two processes that I just mentioned. So the state of New Jersey could mandate the use of a regional system through their offtake agreement, as is my understanding, and BOEM would then issue the easement to that point of interconnection offshore. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to provide what a right of way actually gets a grant holder. So first, any right of way grant holder must first be qualified by BOEM, and so we make sure that anyone requesting that grant is technically and financially and legally qualified to undertake such a project. A right-of-way grant, when it's issued, is 20 feet, 200 feet in width, centered on the cable, although greater widths are available to be requested if there's a demonstrated safety or environmental reason for that. This grant doesn't prevent the granting of other rights by the US either before or after issuance. So it's not exclusive in that, that another cable could potentially cross, or there could be other interests at play from other agencies that could also utilize this area. However, any activities may not unreasonably interfere with other approved activities or existing operations. So we have to make sure that there is coexistence possible with other options. Also, the grant holder agrees that other users may use or occupy any part of the right of way that's not actually used. So there's not a veto on other potential use of the ocean there by the grant holder. And also, I just wanted to mention that BOEM does require financial assurance for decommissioning prior to installation. So this ensures that that at the end of the life of the project, it will be returned to the original conditions, the seafloor. Next slide. And that's the end of my presentation. I think I got it in the correct amount of time, so happy to discuss later, and look forward to the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Josh. Our next speaker is Megan Brunotti, who's the Deputy Chief of Staff for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Megan, welcome, and thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kira, and good morning. I am Megan Brunotti, as Kira said, Deputy Chief of Staff of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I have also served as the department's lead on offshore wind for the past 4 years. I'm happy to be here today with my colleagues from the Board of Public Utilities and the other panelists to discuss offshore wind transmission in New Jersey. Next slide. So in working to achieve our state's goals for offshore wind, as a regulatory agency and the steward of New Jersey's natural resources, DEP must take important steps necessary to address climate change, and while at the same time find the balance of protecting our coastal and aquatic resources on behalf of the people of New Jersey. Next slide. As Andrea discussed earlier, there are several options being considered as part of the transmission solution. And from DEP's perspective, we certainly support an overall approach that reduces the number of cables necessary to transmit power from the wind farm to the onshore infrastructure, as compared to the traditional radial lines that would be associated with each individual project. In order to avoid and minimize impacts to the natural resources that we protect, to the greatest extent possible, onshore cable routes should be sited within existing roads and rights-of-ways. They should avoid or minimize beach crossings, as well as cable installation through back bays and environmentally sensitive areas along New Jersey's coast. Next slide. So early coordination is always a very important part of the DEP's work that we do, particularly with projects of this scale. So the applicants were required to meet with DEP in advance of submitting their applications to PJM. We met with numerous developers who provided an overview of the various proposals that they were planning to submit to PJM. And at that time, DEP was able to provide preliminary feedback on avoidance and minimization measures, as well as potential permitting that may be associated with the projects that were being proposed. Next slide. So the applicants were required to submit an environmental protection plan, and this plan should describe all associated onshore or offshore environmental impacts from the planning, construction, and operational phase of the project. Next slide. Also, the Fisheries Protection Plan was required, which is intended to describe the specific measures that the applicant will take to avoid, minimize, or mitigate, when necessary, potential impacts on fish and also on commercial and recreational fisheries. Next slide would be, permitting plan and stakeholder outreach plan. So the permitting plan is intended to include a discussion of all local, state, or federal permits required to build and operate the project. And in this case, DEP is really taking a close look from the state permitting perspective to assess the feasibility of the projects being proposed. And, internally we say like the permittability of a project being proposed. So we're looking closely at that permitting plan. Also within the applications, we're looking for a thorough discussion of the anticipated environmental benefit of a particular transmission proposal in comparison to radial lines. And we view this effort as somewhat of an alternatives analysis that we really would like to see in comparing and evaluating the impacts from the transmission solutions that are being proposed. And then finally, and importantly, we're looking for a stakeholder outreach plan, which was included with these applications. And that should describe how a project will identify, or in some cases has already identified, environmental and fishery stakeholders, and how the applicant proposes to communicate with those stakeholders throughout the various phases of the project. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, DEP's regulatory oversight is extensive. In reviewing the transmission solution projects that have been proposed, we are looking for consistency with New Jersey's regulations. And just to expand a bit on what I discussed in the last few slides, DEP will specifically be evaluating potential impacts to coastal lands, aquatic and benthic species and vegetation, wetlands, threatened and endangered species habitat, fish and fisheries, marine mammals, birds and bats, and then water and air quality, encumbered lands, and historic resources as well. Next slide. So it's important to note that there are various other federal and state agencies that may have a role in permitting of the transmission projects. Josh mentioned earlier some of the federal agencies that will be involved. In New Jersey, the Pinelands Commission may need to review projects proposed in certain areas to ensure consistency with the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan. And the Pinelands Commission staff did attend several of our pre-application meetings that we held with developers. Also, in some instances, DEP will consult with the New Jersey Department of Transportation and specifically their Office of Maritime Resources. And their review will be necessary in certain cases where activities may be proposed in proximity to state-maintained navigational channels. Next slide. So that was just a quick overview of DEP's role and the various components of the applications that we'll be reviewing and our involvement moving forward. That does wrap up my presentation for now, but looking forward to the discussion later.
Great, thank you, Megan. Our next speaker will be Michael Soul, who is the Vice President for Environmental Services at NextEra Energy. Welcome, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kira, and good morning, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this morning's discussion. NextEra Energy has a wealth of experience in designing, permitting, constructing, and operating clean energy infrastructure across the nation. As the world's next slide, please. As the world's #1 producer of clean energy, we're focused on decarbonizing America. Next slide. Environmental stewardship is at our core, with experience in working in a myriad of environments, to including sensitive coastal ecosystems, as well as desert environments out west. Next slide. Key to that experience includes numerous complex projects that have involved multiple federal agencies, significant NEPA review, as well as coordination with state agencies. Next slide. As part of the process, it's important that, and Megan mentioned this, it's important that we focus on minimizing and avoiding impacts to sensitive environments. And as that process has proceeded, it has started with that consultation that Megan mentioned with local, state, and federal agencies. In addition, it includes evaluation of the existing data that exists off of New Jersey's shorelines, as well as its coastal environments. Included in that evaluation involves understanding those important time of year restrictions for not only marine species, but upland avian and bat species. So these are all things that needed to be part of the development of the plan. And as she mentioned, we also needed to develop that fisheries protection plan, because not only the commercial and recreational value of the fisheries off of New Jersey being important to all stakeholders. Finally, as pointed out, we do need to maximize and have maximized the use of the right-of-ways that exist in the upland areas, as well as previously disturbed areas. Now that we've identified that initial plan, this is where we begin to really dive deep into the project. And that includes doing site-specific surveys to fill those data gaps, enhance our engagement with the communities, as well as key environmental and fishery stakeholders. As a current Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commissioner, I can assure you, while the data is important, it is just as important to speak with those stakeholders about what's important and where certain activities need to be avoided to ensure continued protection of the resource. Finally, with that data and that stakeholder input, we will refine the route based upon it and ensure that we avoid and minimize impacts to the extent practicable. Upon completion of that effort, we will then finalize and submit our right-of-way, right-of-use agreements with BOEM, as well as specific New Jersey DEP permits, Army Corps permits, and finally, the key focus here is to ensure consistency with Coastal Zone Management Act. Next slide. So the key thing is fewer environmental impacts means lower permitting risk. And that is something that we have focused on with this proposal. Next slide. As BPU has mentioned, it's important that we maximize the benefits to New Jersey in providing offshore wind while minimizing the environmental impacts and cost to customers. This is a key facet of the proposal. In our case, examples include looking at the right technology, using high voltage DC to provide better electrical performance and injecting renewable energy into the New Jersey region, while reducing seabed impacts and requiring fewer onshore landings. And this is a technological solution that significantly reduces impacts to the resource. Finally, when you choose that solution that has fewer impacts, again, the most important thing, this reduces permitting risks. Next slide, please. This is just an example to give you a visual as to why it's so important that the BPU process continues, because in order to minimize those impacts, it's essential to really focus and plan that infrastructure improvement for New Jersey. As you can see, the solution to the left significantly minimizes the footprint and impact of cable routes coming into onshore, as compared to an alternative solution where if every wind developer had to bring a landing into the shore. Next slide. So the question of a coordinated transmission approach, can it be done efficiently with an offshore wind development? And the short answer is absolutely. And this is not unusual in the development of renewable energy projects across at least the nation. It's frequent where we're developing a renewable project and the off-taker or the incumbent utility is actually developing the transmission solution for that project. So this is not an unusual event. Next slide. So one of the great ways when you have complex projects like an offshore wind project is that NEPA process will help provide that coordination. And here for major infrastructure, it facilitates it by the range of analyses that are required. So when we look at a NEPA process, and it was mentioned by Boehm earlier, there's going to be an alternative analysis. There's going to be that evaluation of reasonable alternatives to what is originally proposed. And it's also true that whenever you either develop a transmission infrastructure or just the renewable generation, there's going to be that review of the connected actions associated with that project. And that includes the uplands impacts associated with and the community impacts associated with any transmission solution. And then finally, the reasonably foreseeable effects. That analysis is critical to not only looking at the project-specific impacts, but what potential future impacts are anticipated. And we saw this on the Vineyard Wind project, where actual supplemental EIS had to be developed to ensure they looked into the future as to what is anticipated. And the great thing about NEPA is it actually provides that tiering approach where one project can rely on another project's EIS that is established for the same purpose or general region. Next slide, please. So the key feature here is upon selection, I think BOEM can integrate the BPU selection of a transmission provider into either ongoing analyses or future analyses to ensure that those processes and those impacts can be evaluated in concert with the existing proposed project. And the factors here are really looking at minimizing those impacts. So BOEM's ability to scope that now upon selection by the BPU can actually streamline and facilitate future decision-making, both at BOEM as well as the state. And I feel strongly that that coordination between not only BOEM as the federal agency, but the Army Corps of Engineers and the state and the National Marine Fisheries Service in this collective review can ensure that we have a quick and resilient permitting decision if a BPU selection is made. Next slide, please. Finally, it really is the focus to ensure that our transmission solutions with the least environmental impacts provide the greatest permitting efficiencies. The use of technology like HVDC, ensuring that you minimize the number of landings while providing that maximum amount of energy coming to the shore. In our case, it's almost 12,000 megawatts that would be provided and only 3 shore landings. So we really appreciate the opportunity to participate in the BPU process, and I want to thank you and look forward to your questions.
Great, Michael, thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker is Jeff Nield, Senior Technical Consultant on Environmental Matters for EDR Mid-Atlantic offshore development. Jeff, thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for your participation in today's stakeholder meeting. My name is Jeff Neild, and I am a senior environmental consultant with EDR, a small woman-owned consulting company that specializes in environmental affairs for energy projects. I represent Mid-Atlantic Offshore Development, or MAOD, and assist the MAOD development team on environmental and permitting issues. Please let me take a moment to explain that MAOD is a 50-50 joint venture between EDF Renewables North America and Shell New Energies US. EDF Renewables North American portfolio consists of 24 gigawatts of developed solar, wind, battery storage, and other innovative energy projects. Shell's US renewables experience includes 2 current offshore wind energy joint ventures with multiple federal leases on the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf with an estimated capacity of 4.1 gigawatts of offshore wind energy potential. Both EDF and Shell have long successful records of collaboration with project stakeholders and protection of the environment. Next slide, please. During today's presentation, I hope to provoke some thoughts about how New Jersey can promote the development of a sustainable offshore wind energy industry while implementing the state's renewable energy program. Please consider this figure that shows a hypothetical offshore wind energy system consisting of federal offshore wind lease areas with wind farms connected to the regional transmission grid operated by PJM. In this imagined scenario, each wind farm has its own offshore and onshore electrical transmission system. We can refer to this as a radial transmission system. From an environmental perspective, we recognize this offshore wind radial transmission system makes a significant footprint. Each transmission system shown by the colored lines on this figure represent a range of environmental impacts, potential conflicts with other resource users, and permitting challenges. For example, consider for a moment the miles of survey work to identify where to route the submarine cables, the seafloor disturbance that happens when the cables are installed, the area of coastline dedicated to multiple cable landfall locations, and the various onshore transmission corridors that must wind their ways through neighborhoods and natural areas to interconnect with several different substations. What if this hypothetical system can be reimagined or redesigned to minimize its footprint, to thoughtfully plan a transmission system that can deliver just as much offshore wind energy as a radial transmission system? MAOD has proposed a coordinated transmission solution using high voltage direct current, or HVDC technology, common offshore and onshore cable corridors, one carefully sited and executed cable landfall, and optimal substation location for interconnecting with the PJM system. Next slide, please. The advantages of a coordinated transmission solution from an environmental perspective are worth considering. A carefully planned coordinated solution is expected to minimize the overall environmental footprint, both offshore and onshore. Compared to a radial system consisting of multiple independent projects, it greatly reduces the cumulative impacts to air, water, seafloor, fish, and wildlife. A coordinated transmission solution can also decrease the potential conflicts with other resource users. Next slide, please. The coordinated solution that MAOD envisions consists of 3 main components: multiple submarine cables connected to several wind farms routed in a common, carefully sited corridor, 1 landfall site that can accommodate multiple submarine cable landings, 1 common onshore transmission corridor and substation location sited in previously disturbed areas near existing electrical infrastructure. Working in collaboration with Atlantic Shores, MAOD has been able to leverage over 40 environmental and engineering studies that have informed MAOD's project planning process. Next slide, please. When MAOD considered how to optimize its proposed transmission system, it prioritized avoiding and minimizing environmental impacts. It looked at landing the cable from the ocean, doing this underground using horizontal directional drilling methods to avoid shoreline impacts, to route the onshore right-of-way away from wetlands and streams and install the facility underground. MAOD also conducted a New Jersey DEP file review to better understand the permitting and resource management concerns related to potential substation locations. As a result, the onshore substation location avoids documented wildlife habitats, wetlands, and streams. Next slide, please. You can see here some schematics of the 3 MAOD proposals carrying different levels of offshore wind energy to the PJM grid. MAOD's proposals rely on advanced technology and design to achieve environmental protection goals and to overcome permitting challenges. The proposals offer offshore substation location flexibility, where offshore substations can be aligned with wind farms off New Jersey and in the New York Bight. The proposals include an HVDC power corridor from offshore substations to an onshore substation, and a point of interconnection with the JCP&L Larrabee substation. The HVDC technology enables MAOD to transmit more electricity from offshore wind projects through fewer circuits, occupying less area offshore and on land. MAOD's onshore converter station can connect up to 3 existing onshore substations in the PJM grid. In this way, MAOD's proposals are compatible with JCP&L's solution that utilizes existing rights-of-way to transmit power to proposed injection points within the grid. Next slide, please. When we compare the coordinated solution to the hypothetical radial transmission solution, we start to see the possibility of real environmental benefits. The radial system requires more total miles of offshore and onshore cables to be installed, up to 20 to 30% more, depending on how we define each one of those radial systems, which equates to more air emissions from construction vessels and vehicles installing those additional miles of cable. Upwards of 70% reduction can be achieved in seafloor disturbance when placing circuits in one carefully sited corridor, as opposed to multiple independent corridors. This equates to fewer potential conflicts with shipping because cables are routed in one well-sited corridor, and it minimizes the areas that conflicts can occur with commercial and recreational fishing. A coordinated transmission system delivering up to 4,800 megawatts reduces the acreage of land disturbance onshore by approximately 50 to 55% compared to a radial transmission system delivering the same amount of energy. Next slide, please. MAOD, with its partner Atlantic Shores Offshore Wind, is dedicating time and resources to gathering the information necessary to support responsible project planning. Over 40 studies so far and counting demonstrate how these companies are committed to lead with science and to share data. MAOD also shares Atlantic Shore's commitment to environmental stewardship and collaboration with stakeholders in order to coexist with fishermen by enabling fishing activities to continue in its project areas, to minimize and avoid impacts to living marine resources, and to reduce impacts to coastal communities and neighborhoods. These commitments are further defined in MAOD's Environmental Protection Plan and Fisheries Protection Plan, which were submitted to the BPU, PJM, and public for consideration. Next slide, please. Again, I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to addressing some of your questions later on.
Jeff, thank you very much for your presentation. Our next presentation will be by Rob Pollock, Senior Director for Environmental Projects and Services, Licensing and Permitting at PSEG. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Kira. Good morning, everyone. And I wanted to first start out by saying thank you to the BPU staff for coordinating this important panel. As Kira mentioned, my name is Rob Pollock. I am the Senior Director of Environmental Projects and Services and have been with PSEG for 10 years, over 10 years. In my current role, I lead an environmental group internally comprised of permitting, remediation, environmental operations, and compliance. I'm here on behalf of Coastal Wind Link, a partnership between PSEG and Ørsted. We're long-term partners with the BPU, DEP, PJM, and all of our environmental stakeholders. Both companies are committed to support New Jersey's energy infrastructure and clean energy goals, and not merely developers looking to build a project and leave the state. Ørsted has made local investments in this state, working closely with Governor Murphy, the EDA, and others to upgrade port infrastructure, build offshore wind manufacturing and O&M facilities, develop union labor, and establish biodiversity programs and educational partnerships. PSEG has been in New Jersey since 1903 and has a strong track record in working with the state to provide safe and reliable electric and gas service to almost 3/4 of the state's population. Our continuing commitment to our customers and to the environment in New Jersey underlines everything we do. If you could go to the next slide, please. Permitting transmission is very complex and involves active engagement with local communities and many stakeholders throughout the region. Permitting offshore transmission adds to that complexity, bringing in the requirement for coordination across multiple federal and state agencies. The PSEG and Ørsted partnership has successfully dealt with these challenges and brings a tremendous amount of permitting experience to this BPU process, and is underpinned by a long history of successful federal, regional, county, and municipal permitting campaigns within New Jersey. The PSEG and Ørsted partnership began with Ocean Wind, the first offshore wind project in New Jersey, which successfully blends Ørsted's offshore wind experience with PSEG's utility and New Jersey experience. Ørsted also owns and operates America's first offshore wind farm off of Block Island. And more recently, Ørsted has built on its track record of gaining federal approvals as evidenced by the recent construction and operation plan approval from BOEM and other remaining federal permits for the South Fork Wind project just this past January. Additionally, Ørsted has 6 other contracted offshore wind projects on the East Coast with federal and state permitting underway. For the past 10 years, PSEG has been investing between $1 and $2 billion annually in electric transmission and distribution infrastructure, all within New Jersey. To support such a large portfolio, we've been obtaining between 600 and 800 permits per year, as you can see on the bar chart shown here. The pie chart from 2021 illustrates that we work with all levels of governments on a regular basis to navigate through complex permitting processes for many of our projects, including federal, state, regional, county, and local agencies. It is vital that we maintain good working relationships with the permitting folks at all government levels. And I want to point out that each permit comes with a unique set of conditions that we must adhere to. We take our commitment to the agencies very seriously and have implemented an oversight system that monitors maintenance and construction to ensure compliance with all permit conditions. As an example of the complexity of some of our high voltage transmission projects, we have recently permitted and are now reconstructing a 51-mile overhead transmission line, which goes through 17 municipalities, had a NEPA review due to the crossing of a federal wildlife refuge, and required significant state permits as well. This is the kind of experience that drives how the Coastal Wind Link proposals were formed. For example, avoiding the pinelands and minimizing onshore routing and other impacts. If you could go to the next slide, please. Fostering New Jersey's clean energy economy goes beyond permitting activities, and it is important that any developer in this process operate with an approach that respects and enhances the New Jersey ecosystem. We combine our permitting experience with a deep commitment to biodiversity and environmental stewardship. This long-standing commitment, as evidenced in the examples shown on this page, underpin our environmental approach as Coastal Wind Link. I'd like to emphasize PSEG and Ørsted's commitment to working with non-governmental organizations or NGOs, agencies, and other special groups, as well as anyone to support our environmental stewardship as part of this project. For example, PSEG founded and runs the Corporate Wetland Restoration Partnership, to which I am the chair. The partnership is comprised of 34 companies, 19 NGOs and academia, 5 business associations, and 12 federal and state agencies as ex officio members. The partnership is a public-private organization dedicated to the enhancement and protecting of aquatic habitats all throughout the state of New Jersey. Ørsted has committed over $7 million to North Atlantic right whale and marine mammal research through its existing projects. An example of this is the Ecosystem and Passive Acoustic Monitoring Project, otherwise known as EcoPAM, which is a partnership between Ørsted North America, Rutgers University, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and the University of Rhode Island. The project uses acoustic monitoring buoys and an autonomous underwater glider to advance research for detection of Northern Atlantic right whale to better understand their presence, distribution, and seasonality, and to contribute to the characterization of their habitat in offshore wind leases. Ocean Wind has announced, excuse me, something in my eye here, has announced an expanded partnership with Stockton University that supports the project's monitoring and mitigations efforts related to the North Atlantic right whale and other marine wildlife. The partnership will support a first of its kind program at an accredited university and enable Stockton University to train individuals to be protected species observers, or PSOs. Additional funding will enable Stockton University to study the habitat usage of harbor seals in southern New Jersey. This multi-year project will enable researchers at Stockton to remotely monitor harbor seal population patterns and food habits through 2024 and supports larger collaborative projects underway regionally with the Atlantic Marine Conservation Society. Last, PSEG operates and maintains 1,200 miles of overhead and 300 miles of underground high voltage transmission line in New Jersey. We cross some of New Jersey's most sensitive habitats located in the highlands in the north and the pinelands in the south. We work with landowners, agencies, and NGOs to promote habitat enhancement and conservation throughout our system. From working with Rutgers to develop much needed pollinator habitat, to partnering with New Jersey Audubon to promote much needed successional habitat for endangered and avian species. These are the types of things that we incorporate into our project planning and execution all throughout New Jersey. Next slide, please. Designing with the environment in mind is core to the Coastal Wind Link proposals. We do this by using our experience, but also by engaging with stakeholders. Our high-level strategy for siting the offshore and onshore cables is to avoid, minimize, and if necessary, mitigate, which creates beneficial impacts to both the offshore and onshore environment, existing resources. As Megan previously stated, these are the guiding principles of the DEP and other environmental agency approval processes, and are also the foundation by which we route, permit, and develop all of our projects. So avoidance. Our first priority is the avoidance of environmental impacts. And where an impact cannot be avoided, we work to minimize or mitigate. For example, in the siting of cables, we focus on avoidance of prime fishing areas, borrow areas, green acres, and designated open space locations, among others. We also use horizontal drilling construction techniques for landing cables on shore to avoid disturbance to shorelines, including wetlands. And as mentioned, we have ongoing discussions with stakeholders including the Army Corps of Engineers, DEP, and others to get feedback on high priority avoidance areas. Offshore benefits. There are several benefits of our offshore design. For example, our efficient design limits the number of cables needed to bring power to shore, all while servicing multiple lease areas. The project includes redundancy options to limit downtime for renewable energy generation. Ørsted has a dedicated in-house marine affairs team for engagement with marine stakeholders, collecting important feedback that is considered in the design and construction process. The onshore benefits of our proposal are equally important. By routing infrastructure underground in streets or areas that have been previously disturbed, we are limiting any environmental disturbances. We are proud to say that our proposals leverage already developed brownfield sites, including the former fossil-fueled Seawarren Generating Station in Woodbridge. Our knowledge of the many environmentally sensitive areas in New Jersey has informed our extensive construction program and permitting approach by avoiding them wherever possible. And last, responsible siting is key. Coastal Wind Link is designed to efficiently connect to generators, thereby minimizing the footprint of offshore wind projects and their components on the seabed, as well as impacts to fisheries, shipping routes, commercial fishing activities, and existing submarine infrastructure. In addition, participating in forums like this to hear questions and concerns raised from stakeholders and be part of a dialogue is critical to a successful Coastal Wind Link project. So in closing, PSEG and Ørsted are eager to continue our commitment to New Jersey, its residents, natural resources, and its environment. Combined, we have a proven track record on permitting complex electric transmission projects throughout the state while incorporating strong environmental stewardship in all aspects of our business. We plan to continue this approach on Coastal Wind Link in dialogue with stakeholders. Again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important process, and this concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Our next speaker is Captain Paul Eidman, owner and operator of Real Therapy Fishing Charters. Paul, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me and giving us the ability to speak up and participate. As Kira said, my name is Paul Eidman. I'm the owner and operator of Real Therapy Fishing Charters in Tinton Falls, New Jersey. I fish mainly out in Raritan Bay and the New York Bight. We offer fishing charters, whale, and dolphin watching trips. I'm a fourth generation recreational angler, and I've been fishing here locally in the Bight for about 30 years. I hold a Coast Guard 100-ton merchant mariner license, and I also have always worked in marine fish conservation, specifically bunker or Atlantic menhaden, river herring, fish passage, and essential habitat restoration. Next slide, please. Oh, wow, this got cut off. I became an advocate for offshore wind power for a lot of reasons, but predominantly, I feel that we need to transition towards 100% renewable energy and stop burning fossil fuels that are polluting our air and our water. I really want to reduce it to reduce ocean acidification, stall climate change, and reduce storm intensities. The winds, if you haven't noticed, have really cranked up, and it's making our jobs on the water really miserable. Also, renewable energy will help to keep our game fish that we pursue in our waters and stall their northern migration. They are clearly moving northward to seek cooler waters. Also, we want these monopile foundations, as well as the substations, will create offshore habitat for ecosystems to create new ecosystems and increase fishing opportunities. And lastly, it'll create maritime and land-based jobs for years to come. Next slide, please. I had the honor of going up to Rhode Island and fishing at the Block Island Wind Farm. And it's not only a really cool experience, but I witnessed firsthand how not only the great fishing we had right under the turbines, but the effects that the wind farm had on fishing and tourism industries and businesses on Block Island itself, as well as in Point Judith, Rhode Island. Next slide, please. I think locally, getting back to Raritan Bay, like 80 proposals that have been submitted from what I read. Some of them go up the coast, make a left at Sandy Hook, and head westward into Raritan Bay, and that's right where I fish. I think that few of my fellow fishermen realize that since 2007, we've been fishing right on top of a really, really large cable. It's a high voltage cable. It's referred to, and you can look it up, as it's called the Neptune cable. And it runs right down the middle of Raritan Bay, and it runs from Sayreville, New Jersey, all the way to Jones Beach, Long Island. And I can tell you that it has not affected the fishing or migration patterns at all. Each summer and each season, we fish directly over these cables for everything from summer flounders, striped bass, bluefish, you name it. And in the summer, when I do my whale watching trips there, I'm watching whales, turtles, dolphin, even Atlantic sturgeon jumping in the same exact area that the cable is. Next slide, please. So as a New Jersey fisherman and small business owner here in New Jersey, I'm relying on the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities to do this project right. And that means that BPU they'll recognize that one approach is not always the best regarding all landing sites and cable routes. And I'm hopeful that you'll choose the best options with the environmental impacts and costs to ratepayers in mind. My confidence, ensure that all proposed cable landing sites are supported by studies showing cable corridors that are environmentally appropriate. We hope that timing the cable installation so it does not interfere with fishing and or fish migration. We hope that you employ mitigation methods to reduce the impacts during the construction period, and that you'll utilize horizontal drilling methods to go under the more environmentally sensitive areas. It would be good if you could assure the fishing community that they will allow fishing access to all the structures, mainly the substations that are built out on the water. We'd like to have full access to those, just like we do the monopiles themselves. And we hope that the BPU and the selected winner will share the data and the insights that are gained during the survey process with fishing and environmental interests. That's really important. And when it hits on land, we hope that you'll use public right-of-ways that are onshore to lessen environmental impacts in the communities. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to be short, I would like to say thank you so much to the BPU, and I'm hoping that you continue in a responsible manner and put Mother Nature first. I would also like to implore that all maritime interests and all marine stakeholders get involved and participate. I believe that recreational, commercial, and fishermen of all types can coexist with offshore wind, and we need to do our part as active stewards on our resource and our waters. Thank you so much.
Great, Captain Paul, thank you. Our final presentation will be from Eric Stiles, President and CEO of New Jersey Audubon. Eric, welcome, and the floor is yours.
This opportunity. Very excited. New Jersey Audubon first became an advocate for responsibly sited offshore wind back in 2003, including having a conference with Princeton University, keynoted by BPU at the time in 2005, really looking to Horns, Rev, Newstead sites in Denmark for giving us a roadmap for how best to approach this within the state of New Jersey, and so thankful for BPU and the Murphy administration to be where we are today. Next slide, please. So clearly, climate change is the greatest existential threat to fish and wildlife, but also to humans. So if you think about the ecological collapse, we're in essence creating our own asteroid heading to the Earth through the pace and rate and amplitude of climate change. We could, at this point, with the latest predictions from the UN, actually lose more than 2/3 of the fish and wildlife in the state. This will include the collapse of insects, which are needed for human food, threatening and destabilizing the human condition to a point which is definitely catastrophic. Some little tidbits. The outdoor recreation economy in New Jersey is an $18.9 billion industry, providing 142,000 jobs. And you look at the shore tourism industry, which overlaps with outdoor rec, as a $40 billion industry. So clearly getting this right is essential for the future jobs in the Garden State, as well as social imperative. Those with the least will be suffering the most through the climate change scenarios that we're forecasting. So there is an immediate call for action. And for those that may say, well, what is the difference that New Jersey can make in this global context? This is really a case of owning our own backyard and regional responsibility. So it's kind of a race to do nothing or a race to the bottom. If folks point out, well, what's occurring maybe in Asia could offset any gains in the United States. It's really just a red herring for inaction and the status quo, which is completely unacceptable. So proud that New Jersey is taking on its own regional responsibility in this space. But to get it right, it's all about siting and design, and very pleased that BPU and DEP have led with this at the request of Governor Murphy. Next slide, please. So New Jersey's clearly a leader, and a leader means never staying in the same place. It's always looking for that spot of excellence, looking at emerging information, and being the best in the business. An Energy Star refrigerator in the 1950s would be one you'd be very reluctant to plug in today, versus an Energy Star in 2022 is much more efficient. The point being that being on the cutting edge as New Jersey, continuing to look forward, continuing to be excellent, and showcasing excellence, we have this opportunity. Clearly, we began that way with the award of the wind projects by BPU, which are expected to have a high wind yield and minimize and avoid environmental harm through siting location, the two being shown here. Further offshore, you have a significantly lower impact on migrating birds and bats. So that's an example of the avoid and minimize. We're also looking to create good living wage jobs through the industry's work with the administration, making major investments in ports and workforce development. Next slide. Now is our opportunity to showcase that excellence, and we thank DEP working in support of BPU, but BPU in particular, for its deliberate approach to offshore transmission. Transmission, like offshore wind, if not done properly, could have significant impacts to fish and wildlife, including direct and indirect effects such as habitat loss. The SAA proposals, which have been discussed by prior presenters, seek to avoid and minimize this harm. Next slide. So this is a spaghetti string of purple, shows all of the existing cables coming ashore in New Jersey. Most of them are transatlantic telecommunications, but the one thing you'll see they all have in common is they do not cross sensitive barrier islands. By and large, they also seek to avoid sensitive or particular concern habitat areas, such as the extensive seagrass beds of the Barnegat Bay. Finally, as we look to avoid and minimize these impacts, how these are designed and built is very important, as they need to be resilient to avoid future multiple construction efforts. That is, building with change in mind. Next slide, please. So there's several factors, and I'm really pleased to see almost everyone has touched on this. I worked at DEP from 1993 to 2000 within the Division of Fish and Wildlife. I would have applicants come before me and just simply say, how much is it going to cost to build this development? There was no discussion of avoidance. There was no consideration of minimization, and the mitigation was a check. That is the cost of doing business. We're very pleased to say that this administration and BPU is asking the designers of the transmission proposals to first avoid impact and demonstrate that it has exhausted the avoidance before you move to minimize the impacts where avoidance is impossible. And once those two have been exhausted, then move into the mitigation discussions. I can say that as the president of New Jersey Audubon, companies, both renewable energy companies as well as development companies, when they approach us and they lead with the how much will the mitigation cost, I don't have a heck of a lot of faith in those companies. We have very different cultures, very different values. The current approach, again, the SSA proposals follow this hierarchy. We would stress to avoid sensitive natural resource areas, again, like the seagrass beds, and prioritize already developed sites. Of course, within this hierarchy, you minimize the number of cables, including onshore landing, and tie into existing terrestrial infrastructure. The best project are the ones that you may need to engage in some upgrades, but minimize that disturbance. Next slide, please. So we would say, BPU, we would ask you in your review, and PJM and DEP, to first and foremost, make sure the proposal adheres to the hierarchy of avoid to the maximum extent possible, minimize to the maximum extent, and then mitigate. Any company or any applicant that starts out with mitigation, I would say kind of disqualifies themselves right out of the gate, because that's not the values of this administration or what we are seeking to achieve here. In regards to individual applicants, it reminds me, we were just approached by sales team for 4 different finance software companies, and the sales team's always going to put on their best show, promising everything. But it's really as you look under the hood and unpack the track record of the applicants that the difference emerges. So we would encourage BPU to look for companies that have a proven track record in New Jersey, that in that track record have shown consistently a commitment to environmental protection and environmental justice. Second, that BPU and DEP have had positive working experiences with that company. When I worked at DEP, I had friends that worked at environmental consultant firms, and most of them were really good. But one of them came to me and told me directly that their company removed the presence of endangered species. Whenever I read an applicant moving forward from that environmental consultant, I know to take it with almost a grain of salt. So BPU and DEP, the excellent professionals, have had working experiences with these companies, and that should be part of the selection process. Third, that these companies have a proven track record of working with New Jersey stakeholders, not just governmental entities, but also nonprofits, technical experts, and community groups. Again, within the climate change scenario, those with the most will suffer the least, and we need to ensure that equity and justice are present in the offshore wind transmission projects. Finally, you would want to select a company that has a demonstrated commitment to the state of New Jersey. Next slide, please. So this is part of the continuing best practices looking to move forward. We would ask that BPU and DEP work to ensure monitoring and reporting during and post-construction to the agency and public knowledge. Second, that all of the raw data, analyses, and reports related to public resources, those would be social and environmental resources, are free and easily available to the public, continuing BPU's excellent track record in that space. Third, consider cumulative and not just project-specific impacts. We don't want to have the death of 1,000 cuts here, so having that more comprehensive framework is important. And finally, BPU and DEP, in their own internal processes, conduct this assessment and provide public reports on ways to improve this moving forward. Next slide. I thank you for the opportunity. New Jersey Audubon is very appreciative for the deliberate approach BPU and DEP have taken under the leadership of Governor Murphy. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, very much for your presentations. And I wanted to thank all of our presenters for their presentations this morning. We'll now take a short break until 11:45. When we return, we'll commence our moderated panel. We will accept all written comments, but for the moderated panel, we'll be posing only those questions relevant to today's topic, which is environmental and permitting issues specifically related to the state agreement approach. Thank you, and we'll see you all again at 11:45. Hello, everyone. Just going to give folks another minute or two to come back from break, and then we'll commence our panel. Great. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody back, and I request that panelists please turn your videos on so we can have an open discussion here. So panelists, if you'd like to, most of these questions will be directed to the full panel, but there will be some specific questions for specific panelists. If you'd like to raise your hand or just come off mute, if you'd like to offer a response, that would be helpful. For those of you who are listening today, we welcome you to type your SAA specific questions that are related to environment and permitting issues into the Q&A, and board staff will make sure that they come through to me so I can ask them of our panelists. So I'd like to start out with a couple of very general questions. There already have been a few specific questions submitted through the Q&A interface that I'll get to in a minute, but I want to start at a macro scale. So the first question, and this is for all of you, from your perspective, what are the most significant environmental concerns associated with offshore wind transmission? And you should anticipate I'm going to ask you, how does a coordinated approach potentially address some of those? So we'll start with just that first part, which is from your standpoint, what are the most significant environmental concerns that are associated with offshore wind transmission? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Kara, I can go. Thank you. This may not be exactly at the answer the person is looking for, but I think the significant issue is that along the eastern seaboard, we are struggling with finding ideal and optimized locations to connect our offshore wind energy projects. I don't think we ever developed our coastal transmission and distribution electrical systems with the idea of having offshore generators like we're hoping to have over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So we're playing catch up on planning that infrastructure. So that means we're kind of retroactively doing it, or we're trying to deal with what we have in order to find the best places to connect. So that means all of us on the phone involved or in this meeting dealing with this, have to be smart about the way that we do it and look for opportunities like this particular PJM and BPU effort to come up with solutions that can work with the systems that we have and make smart investments to upgrade the existing system. And of course, while we do that, we're trying to minimize environmental impacts both offshore and onshore.
Thank you. Michael, you want to jump in there?
Thank you, Kara. Well, I agree with Jeff that having that infrastructure established to accept and inject additional offshore wind is going to be a critical element. To the question that you asked, what are one of the most significant issues? I really think it involves reducing the number of points of interconnect so that you can reduce the footprint of any offshore cabling coming into the state of New Jersey. Not only is that going to reduce the environmental impacts in total, you're also going to reduce community impacts. And that's an important thing to the developed shoreline off of New Jersey. So it's going to be really evaluating those scenarios that can bring the maximum amount of energy onshore, NextEra's proposal actually goes as high as almost 12,000 megawatts to bring onshore, which actually exceeds the governor's goals, but still limits that impact, that footprint.
Anybody else want to comment here?
Sure. I think it all comes down to location, design, and minimization. I also think that typically terrestrially, the cheapest places to put infrastructure, linear infrastructure, have been through parks and poor neighborhoods. So there's an opportunity to kind of rewrite and reset that wrong. Nothing new to add here, but I do think, again, the transparency of the underlying data is also something that is not part of the terrestrial system. So BPU and trying to ensure the transparency of the data and reports, I think, is also going to lead to exponential improvement in the decisions as we go through this iterative process.
Thank you. Megan?
Just from a DEP's perspective, I'd say in looking at these proposals, the most significant environmental concerns come into play in the coastal environment. Impacts areas such as freshwater and coastal wetlands, the system for aquatic vegetation.
Hey, Megan.
Yes.
Your voice is getting a little bit of feedback. If you would be able to toggle just your audio settings, we're going to try and fix that real quick.
Sure, what else? What you need me to do?
If you go to the little caret next to the mute icon and just change the microphone from whatever you have it selected to another option and then back again, usually that fixes the problem. So right next to where the mute button is, there's a little caret and you should be able to select a different device. I don't think it's better. You might have to leave the Zoom and come back if this doesn't work.
Did you go back to your original setting, Megan?
Just tried it again.
Okay. I think you should probably sign out, sign back in, and we'll give you a chance to comment when you join us, but we'll perhaps move on to another question, and I'll direct that at someone else who's a specific question at someone else while you're out. We'll see you in a minute. While we wait for Megan to return, there was a specific question for you, Josh, which was, can you discuss the use of the transmission right-of-way process to date?
Sure. So the existing right-of-way grant we have out there now is the cable that export cable that connects the Block Island wind farm to the mainland, as it does cross federal waters. And so because that project, although the actual Block Island wind farm is in state waters and is a state project, that cable crossing required a right-of-way grant because it supports transmission from renewable sources offshore. In addition, that there have been proposals in the past for various right-of-way grants. Way back there was I think it was the Atlantic wind connection proposal that was later scaled down and then was not connecting offshore wind. So that ended up not going forward. And there have been a couple of proposals for regional systems that were proposed, and we issued a request for competitive interest for the New York, New Jersey Ocean Grid project. Since then, BOEM has taken a much sort of holistic look at transmission planning, recognizing many of the concerns that folks have raised today. And so we've been working in a number of capacities, including with Department of Energy, to look at ways to sort of optimize transmission planning going forward. So the right-of-way process will likely be a part of future plans, and we appreciate the work New Jersey is doing as well in their planning process to support various systems that would require such. So.
Thank you. Another kind of related question for you while we wait for Megan to join us again. Does BOEM expect that the offshore substations, assuming those are used, would be sited within existing lease areas?
So for existing sort of generation projects, so the actual leases, they often will propose substations that collect the array, so the NRA from the various wind farms go to a substation, and usually that is within the lease. For sort of the projects that are likely to come out of the New Jersey process, I think we have to look at what's proposed before we would make that call. I think it's probably less likely that a collector station would go into an existing lease, because we want to make sure we're not unreasonably interfering with an existing lessee.
Great, thank you.
But if there was coordination among a lessee and a project that comes out of this, there could be that potential, but that's sort of speculative.
Sure. Megan, I'm going to pivot back to you because you were in the middle of responding to the initial question.
Kira, how do I sound?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I won't go back completely. I was kind of listing out, but really it's we're most concerned about the environmentally sensitive areas near shore and impacts to all of the regulated areas that fall under our purview. So, particularly I think in the marine environment, but there are also significant issues that could be faced on land as well. So a number of impacts to consider. And I just think that by kind of planned transmission, we can thoughtfully approach this. And the intent would be to avoid and minimize impacts as we discussed. And I think as some of my fellow panelists have noted prior to me here.
Certainly having them, the options on the table all at the same time to look at gives you some sense of what the, potential benefits and challenges are for each. So I think, to your point, that's helpful to be able to see them all at the same time. Okay, any other comments about the potential benefits of a coordinated transmission approach relative to the radial approach? And specifically with environmental considerations in mind. Okay. So I'll move on to the next macro question here. How are commercial fishing interests being considered in the planning and evaluation of transmission solution proposals in the SAA? So, from the standpoint of developers, how did fishing interests factor into the plans that you developed? And from the standpoint of the regulators, how will those interests be incorporated into your considerations of the projects before you? Go ahead, Michael.
Never shy. So I think it's a two-part answer. First, not only by minimizing the footprint of cable landings, I think you can address some of the concerns that fishermen and women may have, both commercial and recreational. In addition, I think really looking at that timing of construction, because predominantly for the cable landing, the most impact's going to be during that construction window. So you evaluate that timing of when you're going through areas that may be important to fishermen and fisherwomen, so as to avoid that impact. Goes back to the avoid, minimize strategy.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. So MAOD has a memorandum of agreement with Atlantic Shores, and together they've spent years working with commercial and recreational fishermen and the entire industry, not only employing people from the industry to serve as liaisons and representatives, but to spend time either on the docks through Zoom or Teams meetings, or face-to-face meetings when they could during the pandemic, to include them in the planning process. So when you're sitting at the table with people that the project is going to impact, and you're getting their feedback with respect to the state of the science, the data that you've collected regarding the project area, and then the designs that you have for your project within those areas. You do this collaborative planning approach where people can contribute their ideas and try to make the project something that everyone can get behind. And to Captain Paul's comments earlier, there's many people in the fishing industry that see this as a tremendous opportunity, not only for them, but also for the broader industry and New Jersey. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Eric, go ahead.
If we don't address climate change, there will be no fisheries. Ocean acidification, all of the things that I love to eat and I grew up at the Jersey Shore, Linwood, clamming and playing out in the ocean. If you think of what's at stake, if we don't address this, it's not just a bird issue or a people issue. The economic displacement is going to occur at a level that have never been seen before. And for folks that live at the barrier islands, your homes are gone. The gravity of the situation here it's real, it's present. And I'm not diminishing, that our commercial fisheries industry is incredibly important to the state. So of course, New Jersey Audubon would encourage BPU and DEP to continue to engage that key group. But I think if we don't step back and look at the fact that our lives are gone, our jobs are disrupted, massive extinction, you have to have that context in mind.
Thank you. Megan.
Thanks. And, I agree with Eric. We have to look at this kind of holistically in addressing the impacts of climate change. I'll just say, the DEP and specifically our Marine Resources Administration will evaluate proposals to ensure that impacts are avoided or minimized. And as I said earlier, it is our intent to utilize this process to thoughtfully plan for transmission. We would be reducing the number of potential cables coming to shore, and therefore hopefully reduce the potential impacts to commercial fisheries overall. Also, as we evaluate the siting of the cables and the routes that they will take from the wind farm to the onshore infrastructure, we'd be looking to avoid prime fishing areas, sensitive habitat, including shellfish habitat, as well as buffers to artificial reefs. And also important to note, the burial depth of the cable is a critical factor. And that will be something that we will be assessing as we review proposals. And, just to note, there is an ongoing effort to identify from a regional perspective, the gaps in data and information. And, DEP and BPU are working together through our regional, through our research and monitoring initiative to kind of develop projects, look for projects and fund those that can fill those gaps in research, including the need for information regarding impacts to fisheries as well as wildlife.
Thank you, Megan. Rob, did you want to comment here? You had your hand up a moment ago.
Please, Gary. Yep. As an avid fisherman and Captain Paul, I also have a 100-ton fishing license and captain's license and fish in Raritan Bay on a regular basis. We appreciate, the local concerns with the recreational fishing as well as the commercial fishing. And as I mentioned, Ørsted has established its own internal marine affairs group. So we view this as working collaboratively with the recreational and commercial fishing to avoid the sensitive resources. Look, we can have maps, map upon map that's produced, but without having the engagement of the fishermen and the local folks, I think that's a major miss. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Josh, I believe your hand was next.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to point out from the federal perspective, when we are sort of designating leasing areas, we attempt to sort of minimize those conflicts from the outset through quite a bit of engagement, whether that's through the state renewable energy task forces or various fisheries meetings. And then all of our leases do require fisheries liaisons to be employed by our lessees, and as well as the development of fisheries communications plans to have the lessees directly engage with the commercial fishing industry to find ways to avoid conflict. And I think as someone also mentioned, with cable burial depth, we also do require cable burial depth assessments to find ways to ensure that those cables are buried to an appropriate depth to avoid conflicts, not just with fisheries, but anyone that is utilizing the ocean floor. So.
Thank you, Josh. Captain Paul, go ahead. You're on mute, sir.
Sorry.
Thank you.
One of these days I can hang out of Zoom. I don't want to repeat anything that anybody else has said, but I just think, as a fisherman on the water, we see the evidence of climate change every single day. Okay, so I think that a lot of the voices out there that are against offshore wind come at it from an anti project perspective. They all acknowledge climate change to a point, but they fail to recognize the linkage between offshore wind, renewable energy, and climate change. And I think it's up to all of us to emphasize that there is a direct connection, and that offshore wind happens to be the fastest route to achieving our anti-climate change goals. As far as on the water, I've been paying attention to survey vessels and activities at sea, and between NOAA and NIMS and BOEM, I think the general public has to understand that there's deliberate standards and daily practices that are respected on the water. And the mere presence of a sea turtle popping up ceases all operations, okay? And you got to remember that on the water, maritime activities are really, really expensive. So when a sea turtle sits there for 3 hours and there's crews around and hardware in the water, this means a lot to them, and they all respect it. So these accusations that the powers that be are not paying attention, or it's just they're being rolled over, it's just not happening on the water. And then you're going to have, I guess there'll be substations, and I'm curious about the question that was asked about the placement of the collector station as opposed to the transfer stations and or the inter-array station in the field. So I think that's an important one to address. There's a lot of considerations that went into selecting the lease areas, and to all of a sudden have a structure in the middle of nowhere, it's going to definitely take some further development when and if this moves forward. I'm mainly concerned a lot about the disturbance of toxic sediments and things like that. But I have to say that in this time of energy transmission, I don't perceive, I think that it's important for us to be patient. I mean, we have beach replenishment projects that go on for weeks and weeks at a time with these giant sediment plumes that come off, and nobody says a word about that. So I think that in terms of burying cables and all this, I think it's going to be an inconvenience. We hope that it's timed correctly between marine mammal and fishing interests. There are windows that we hope that are moving forward. And I'm here to answer questions too. Sorry if I went a little long on that.
Thank you for your thoughts, Captain Paul. Michael, back to you.
Yeah, hey, just because Captain Paul brought up a good question that it also piqued my curiosity, and this goes back to Josh's statement about co-locating the offshore substation. If the SAA moves forward, BPU makes a selection. Now the state's established its interest in bringing offshore wind transmission to the shore. The expectation is there would be coordination with the offshore wind developers. And I wanted to see if I understood Josh's answer correctly, that, yeah, under that coordination, you probably would be acceptable of citing that offshore substation within the existing lease.
So I think it would sort of depend what the goal of the project being proposed was. Obviously there are substations that are often cited within existing projects for the purposes of that project exporting its power. If you're talking about sort of a collector station that links multiple projects, it may not be the best location to have it in an existing lease area. We also would have to sort of evaluate the ability of an existing lessee to, sort of develop their project as needed. So I don't want to speculate too much in that it sort of depends what's being proposed and how, and sort of what the what that coordination looks like. If we do encourage, if you look at our our final sale notice coming out of the New York Bight area, we are encouraging sort of adjacent lessees to sort of look for ways to work together. So there could be specifically for transmission purposes. So if we did get a proposal where two or more lessees were looking to cite things to their mutual benefit, we could certainly evaluate that.
Great, thank you all. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to comment that we appreciate the public's considerations and concerns, but want to remind the stakeholders that today's meeting is looking at environmental and permitting issues related to the transmission component of offshore wind, whether it's coordinated or radial, so specifically the SAA. I'm going to get to a couple of specific questions that are SAA relevant here now, and then we'll go back to the macro scale in a minute here. So these are for Megan from DEP. Megan, I think one of the questions that came through at the end of your presentation was asking why historic shellfish beds didn't seem to be on the list that you had up. Can you comment on that?
Sure, thanks, Kira. So shellfish beds are certainly not meant to be excluded in any way, but rather I think it was intended that they were included in the list under fish and fisheries in that category. The list is certainly an example of our regulatory authority, but not necessarily inclusive. And I'll just note, DEP is committed to protecting shellfish and shellfish habitat and obligated to do so pursuant to our rules and enforceable policies. And specifically in one of my earlier slides, reference the Coastal Zone Management Act, and obviously shellfish are listed as a special area under our coastal zone management rules. So as I said, we're committed and obligated to protect shellfish.
Thank you, Megan. Another specific question for you. Another one of our stakeholders commented, avoiding pinelands appears to be a priority over avoiding coastal wetlands. Can you comment on that, please?
Sure. Yeah, as far as pinelands goes, that was included in the presentation just to note that the Pinelands Commission plays a role in these types of reviews as well. So they'll review some of the projects as necessary, and I just wanted to point that out, trying to point out that other New Jersey agencies may also be involved in addition to DEP's regulatory authority. But obviously impacts to coastal wetlands are of utmost important to DEP, and any potential impacts in those regulated areas must be compliant with our regulations.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so a broader question for all of our panelists. Can you talk a bit about the relative environmental impacts of HVDC versus HVAC transmission, and sort of discuss the differences that might come along with installation, environmental footprints of those and whatnot might be best directed to developers, but if others have comments, we'd be happy to hear them. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Kira. So the relative benefit of HVDC is primarily, well, not primarily, it's a couple of things. First, you can bring more power onshore through a single cable using HVDC. So you're minimizing the number of cable lands that are required to deliver that power. The other benefit is your right-of-way area candidly can be smaller. You can place HVDC cables closer to each other, thereby minimizing the overall footprint if multiple cables are required to bring that onshore. There's less line loss associated with HVDC. So the amount of power that you're producing from your wind projects not going to be degraded by line loss associated with, or as much line loss associated with an AC system. So those are some of the primary benefits of moving towards an HVDC is by being able to move more power in fewer cables, reducing line loss, you're going to minimize the overall environmental footprint of that project.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to chime in here? Okay, so we'll move on to another question. Let's see. This one came through our Q&A. What protections, and this is, I think, for Josh and Megan, what are the protections within your respective agencies to ensure that the necessary permits and studies are completed?
Yeah, so I guess from a federal perspective, you know, that any lessee or grant holder is required to be in compliance with all applicable federal and state laws, so that they, you know, they would need to secure any sort of permits prior to any sort of construction or installation operations. You know, our process, we review all that as part of a construction operations plan or a general activities plan, as well as through the associated consultations that are done via the NEPA process, the environmental impact statement, for example. So, you know, all sort of environmental impacts are evaluated prior to any sort of approval of any project, and certainly before any sort of construction work is done.
Thank you. Megan?
Yeah, I think I would kind of echo what Josh said, except from, you know, from the state perspective. And so we're looking at compliance with New Jersey's statutes and regulations. I'll just note that currently our role here is, you know, looking at these projects kind of conceptually as they have applied to PJM, and we don't have any applications before us, but you know, when we do, we would be looking to ensure that any of those proposed activities are consistent with New Jersey's regulations.
Great, thank you. And Megan, sort of as a corollary there, can you talk about how stakeholders might be able to participate in the permitting process?
Yeah, sure. So again, you know, in the future, when there are applications submitted relative to these potential projects, DEP will be obviously evaluating them as any other application to ensure compliance with our rules. And there are several ways that stakeholders can participate in our permitting process. These all kind of determined by the rule that applies to that particular permit. So those opportunities include submitting public comment or attending public hearings if applicable. And just on that note for the audience, I would just note that you know, DEP is endeavoring to be open and transparent in all of these kind of processes related to offshore wind. And so we do have on our webpage a place where we will be posting applications as we receive them so that the public can view them right online at our webpage. And also we'll be providing links to provide public comment right there through the webpage, in the future when these applications do come into the department.
Great, thank you, Megan. And if anyone else wants to chime in about how information related to their projects might be available for the public to see what's planning, should the project be awarded, you can feel free to comment. Okay, so I'll move on to another.
If I could just jump in. This is Eric.
Please do, Eric.
I would ask BPU and DP to consider that all of the data, which is related to a public resource, be mandated to be public as part of the proposal process. I'm not talking about proprietary information. I'm talking about information on shellfish, birds, environmental impacts, contaminants getting integrated into the estuarine systems, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you for that. One specific question for you, Eric, is one of our stakeholders asked, can you elaborate on what you said about avoiding choices that would cite the impacts within natural areas and poor neighborhoods? Can you talk a little bit more about that topic?
Sure. If you look historically throughout the United States, whenever a transmission line is being proposed terrestrially, they tend to come through the cheapest linear foot would be through an existing park. That would be a nonprofit, local, state, federal, and poor neighborhoods. And the reason, quite frankly, is there is less political resistance in those areas. So when I talk about equity, is ensuring that regardless of the income of a community, regardless of the ethnic composition of that community, regardless of the language of that community, that we adhere to the same standards to ensure that any harm is equitably felt. The flip side is the equitable benefits. So for example, we spend billions of dollars pumping sand onto beachfronts. That increases the property values of those homes. In exchange, people have access to beaches as those beaches become public. So I think as we move forward through this process is ensuring both the harm is shouldered equitably and the benefits are accrued equitably.
Thank you, Eric. A question for developers. Can you talk a little bit about what when you're planning a project, do to seek to avoid impacts on natural resources, and talk about your environmental assessment process as you're planning your projects? Rob, do you want to start there?
So with all of our projects in New Jersey, we have a very complex system that we utilize to evaluate impacts on all of our suggested or proposed routes for transmission. And it starts with just a base of publicly available information. Then we'll start to dive deeper into local concerns. As Eric pointed out, we'll also dive into specific environmental concerns, either whether it be a threatened or endangered species, a nesting area, you name it. We have a pretty extensive database of information that's locally available. And once we come to a refined route, we will work closely with DEP as well as the local folks to make sure we're not impacting resources negatively. So it's a reiterative process. We start at a high level and you dig down and keep getting deeper and deeper until you come up with the best route available.
Go ahead, Michael. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, generally, I think Rob nailed it. That's the process for siting projects. We have a team of 150 biologists and engineers here at NextEra that are focused on evaluating that data and finding the right solutions in addition to, in this case, the team there in New Jersey and their 40 years of experience in identifying these resources. So the data is critical, as Rob pointed out, collecting that existing data and filling in the gaps with your own assessments and sharing that with the agencies, both federal, state, and local. But again, I cannot emphasize enough the need to also reach out to the stakeholders. As a former agency head, I know that data is good. Data is something that will drive decisions, but you'd be surprised how local knowledge can significantly improve that data set and that understanding. So that's the additional need to reach out and engage stakeholders.
Thank you, Michael. Jeff, want to add something there?
Yeah, just to add to what Rob and Michael said, which I agree with wholeheartedly, is that, you know, MAOD believes in leading with science, and that is not a singular pursuit. You utilize the resources and the people that are available to you in a cooperative way. So that's talking with agencies, that's talking with non-governmental stakeholder groups and academia, and figuring out what the current state of the science is regarding our marine or terrestrial resources, and then specific to the project, designing investigations and studies to better understand what the baseline environmental conditions are, so that you can evaluate the potential impacts from your project. So, you know, it's a multi-year process. It costs a lot of money and a lot of time, but there's really no other way to do it. And that is what MAOD's committed to.
Thank you all. Captain Paul, can you talk a little bit about potential implications for recreational fisheries and anglers of a coordinated approach as opposed to the radial approach? Do you see particular benefits or you know, challenges that are associated with the more coordinated transmission approach as opposed to the radial approach?
Sure, I think that the general public, like, they're not really separating this particular ask from the offshore wind farms themselves. So if the offshore wind farm plan was to, okay, we're going to have, let's say, 6 offshore wind farms off the coast of New Jersey, then each one of those wind farms would have a separate export cable landing at 6 different locations. Okay, so what this project specifically is trying to do is to put basically a giant extension cord, if you will, one line, and then have all the developers move into that one. So therefore reducing the need to have a radial cable or a large single cable from each one. And that to me, from an environmental perspective, that's really the key. That's the goal here, to land less on shore, to do it in places that are nearby existing, you know, electric infrastructure. I think does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Michael, do you want to chime in here too?
Nope, I'm all right.
Okay, great, thank you. Anybody else want to comment there? Okay, Josh, a specific question for you. Can you outline I know you did some of this in your presentation, but can you talk a little bit about the process and the timeline specifically for BOEM approval of projects that might come before you? I know you talked kind of about like the 2 different ways that could proceed, but if you can talk a little bit about the timeline, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, assuming that this would be a right-of-way grant, and we were past sort of a competitive interest threshold there, once it's issued, there's a 1-year period where the grantee goes out and does all of sort of the survey work that would support the project that they would be proposing. You know, and this allows them to identify, you know, any sort of obstacles or environmental harms or cultural resources that might be present on the seafloor, as well as collecting the needed information needed to propose the project from a technical perspective. Once we get that, it's in the form of a general activities plan, and that is a, you know, a document that lays out sort of the window of things that would accomplish that project. Once BOEM reviews that and deems it complete and sufficient, it kicks off the notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement, presuming an environmental impact statement would be used, which I think is the most likely scenario. And that process involves, analyzing all the potential, all the potential environmental impacts. And that's typically about a 2-year process. And so that involves quite a bit of consultation. There's a draft statement. There's stakeholder engagement involved with that, as well as mandatory comment periods, just to make sure we have all that information needed to decide whether to approve or deny or approve with modifications that project. So once that's complete, then we would get to a point where we would get to sort of a record of decision, and that's the point where we say, okay, we are agreeing with this general activities plan and the environmental impact statement that's associated with it. And it's not until that point where we get sort of the facility design report that gives the exact specifics of the exact equipment being used and the methods being used. And it's not until we get through all that process that any sort of construction would exist. Does that kind of get there? Is there? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, just in terms of the overall time frame.
Yeah.
A sense of.
So I mean, it's a few years minimum, I guess, would be the really quick answer there, just based on those steps. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Eric, want to come back to you. In your presentation, you talked quite a bit about avoiding and minimizing impacts and starting there. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more fully to how you see the SAA facilitating that approach.
Thank you. So one is in the direct route. So first of all, when you have fewer linear infrastructures, there's a reduced likelihood of disruption, right? Because each linear feature is going to have an impact on the landscape. So the fewer is better. Second, if you put the backbone, you're going to have far fewer miles. So not only is it the number of, in a radial, you'll think about spokes from a wheel, and you lay them all together, there's just a heck of a lot more linear miles. Then finally, it really allows you, since you have far fewer, it allows you to do a better job avoiding sensitive resources. They could be really important for I'm thinking of whether it's scallops or surf clams to seagrass. It allows you to do things like go horizontal drilling under sensitive features. So the less, the better, and it allows for more avoidance. One of the other speakers also touched on something which is very important, which is community knowledge. So data is both what is known by technical experts and agencies, but qualitative data is just as important. And this is where working with a company that has those relationships with communities on the ground in New Jersey can, in essence, build out data gaps that are really held at the local level.
Great, thanks, Eric. Anybody else want to comment on avoiding and minimizing before we get to mitigate as part of the SAA process?
Sure, I just have one thing to add. Agree with Eric 100%. I don't know, how many folks are aware, but New Jersey is the only state with a federally delegated wetland regulation program through DEP. So the DEP has taken wetlands, specifically freshwater wetlands and coastal wetlands, to another level above the rest of the nation. So we as a regular practice do everything we can to avoid wetlands if possible. There's not, an expansive amount of wetlands in New Jersey, so they are protected more than any other state. So, that's kind of ingrained in us to avoid resources like that.
Great, thank you, Rob. Anybody else want to comment there? Okay, I'm gonna
just a quick note that that Florida has the similar delegated program. So there's now 2 states in the nation that have the 404 delegation.
Thank you, Michael. Eric, do you want to say something else there?
I was just going to have fun, but we do it better. I spent a lot of time in Florida. I'm proud to call this state my home.
Thank you. Us too. Let's see some specific questions coming through the Q&A. Megan, this one's for you. Could you please review the environmental impact review that is part of NJ, the process here? Part of the SAA review process. Can we talk a little bit about your review process?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of went into that a bit earlier, but you know, what we are really looking at is overall these kind of conceptual applications that have been submitted to PJM, and so they're not actual applications before the department, but we are serving in kind of a support role as BPU reviews these with PJM. And so we're looking at all of the regulated areas and that these activities may be impacting and ensuring compliance with our rules. And then we're also looking to ensure that the developers have a good understanding of the permitting that will be required for these projects. So in advance of actually submitting applications, we want to ensure that that the applicants have a good understanding of what will be required and what they're going to have to do to meet our rules in order to be able to get an permit and approval at the end. So there is a extensive team at DEP that is going to be part of this review process. They already are, and we're really getting into it a lot lately, but a number of staff from all across the department and the various permitting programs and consultative programs within DEP will be reviewing the applications to provide feedback to BPU.
Thank you. Another one that's sort of related, is there a public facing website to track the permitting process of the projects?
So from our standpoint, like I said earlier, there are several different ways, I guess, to track just generally permit applications at DEP. The main way of doing that, the method that's been in effect for many years, is the New Jersey DEP Bulletin, which is published every 2 weeks on our webpage. And so that is where anyone can go to look to see what applications are currently under review by the department. But that is a bit cumbersome sometimes. And so in an effort to be transparent and forward-facing on offshore wind projects specifically, we will be, as I mentioned earlier, posting them on our webpage, which is nj.gov/DEP/offshore wind. And then there's various tabs, and you would be able to find applications posted there. And also a very streamlined approach to submitting comment on those applications once they are posted in the future.
Thank you. One more for you, I think, Megan, maybe perhaps also Josh. How do you establish which sensitive species to focus on? And once a species is marked for some sort of additional protection, what's the process? So that's probably both federal and state regulations. Can each of you speak to that?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to another question earlier, and it just, you know, we are bound to review and obligated to ensure consistency and compliance with our rules and regulations. So particularly for these projects under, for the state, a lot of our authority falls under the coastal zone management rules and all the various protected species and habitat that fall under those rules. So from the state perspective, you know, that is our authority and obligation there.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, in the federal process, that they're, you know, obviously any of our lessees are required to comply with all federal laws, and so probably the Endangered Species Act consultations, the habitat consultations, benthic surveys that are done, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act are all sort of part of those consultations. So we work with federal and state partners and stakeholders in general to identify relevant information like that. So consultations with NIMS and other agencies, Fish and Wildlife, for example, would go into determining potential impacts.
Okay, and a follow-up to that, can you talk a bit about the stakeholder process related to, a project before you? I know you don't have any SAA projects specifically before you, but should New Jersey make a determination that would involve a federal work by BOEM, can you comment on stakeholder process there?
Sure. Yeah, there's many sort of stakeholder engagement metrics or methods in our process. Probably the most relevant is sort of the public comment windows that are associated with any project. When they're being proposed, there will be, the environmental impact statements, for example. When a draft is released, that opens a comment window. In many cases associated with projects, we host public meetings. We trying to engage that way. And then we also typically require for offshore wind projects that, there are communications plans from the lessees themselves to engage on various aspects with sort of affected groups.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Eric, you wanted to weigh in here. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I've never seen one project change once it gets to the EIS state. I think that there's so much momentum and involvement. I mean, there's some tweaks that I've seen made, but I think that the approach BPU is taking with BOEM and DEP, which is really front loading this process with as much data as you can. I would encourage to front load, and it sounds like this is something Josh was also saying, the stakeholder meetings well in advance of the EIS, because again, once an EIS is put on the table, the project is typically almost fully baked. So I think the more transparency you can have, the more stakeholder engagement you can have, and the more that information is shared with the public writ large, the better off we will be moving forward expeditiously. Because again, I think if folks are asking for us to slow this down, every day is another major loss. We don't have the luxury of time, but we do have the luxury of getting it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, I guess the only other point I'd like to point out is we do convene our renewable energy state task forces pretty regularly, and in the development of, say, the New York Bight lease sale that was just recently engaged, that was a process of many years and many meetings and many specific meetings for collecting that exact information. So, we continue to try to engage as much as we possibly can. So I definitely appreciate that comment.
So thank you, Josh and Eric. So I'm going to, in a moment, give you a chance to ask questions or raise questions for each other, but wanted to give you a heads up about that. I'm going to ask one more question here from our stakeholders. And this is a follow-up, Josh, on one of your answers a moment ago, which is requesting that you elaborate on the communications plan required under the BOEM process. And does that include local engagement?
Yeah, so we, I guess I would encourage people to look at sort of our website for the exact details on the various communications plans that we have. They require sort of outreach for specific issues. One of them is a fishery communication plan. We also have tribal government communications plans and agency communications plans to sort of lay out how our lessees will communicate with various groups.
Thank you. So now I'd like to open the floor to our panelists to see if you have questions or topics you'd like to discuss in our sort of last few minutes here. Go ahead, Rob.
This is just a question for Josh. I would assume that this project would eventually make its way to the FAST 41 dashboard, the federal process dashboard. This is kind of a comment and a question, but Kira, you had asked the question, how could somebody track what's going on at a permitting level? There is a Fast 41 dashboard available to the public, and you can go on there and basically see where in the process a project is. Obviously, that wouldn't be established until after this is awarded and things start moving forward. But Josh, I just wanted to make sure that that's the case here.
Yeah, there's some criteria that goes into what can be established as a Fast 41 project, and I think you rightly note that a project like this is likely something that could be covered, and so there's an application process from the developer that would establish them as a Fast 41 project, and that website does lay out sort of the permitting schedules and expected dates for completion of those consultations and permits. So that isn't, you're correct. That's another place once you get a little further down the line that someone could go to check on the status of the project.
Okay, other questions for each other here? Thank you. Go ahead, Eric.
So question for the private developers. What can DEP and BPU and many nonprofits do to incentivize sharing of data? Understanding that information is a key commodity, yet at the same time, given the urgency and the need for sharing findings in a way that the company would be held harmless. So if you do your homework and you discover something during construction, obviously you need to be incentivized to share that information.
So this is Mike. I mean, I'll give you an example, Eric. Undiscovery or unanticipated discoveries that occur during construction. That's a normal process that projects will have unanticipated discovery plan that includes notification. And in many cases, that includes notification to the State Historical Preservation Officer, as well as in this case would probably be the Corps and New Jersey DEP in describing exactly what transpired. That kind of open and public documentation is readily provided to the agencies, and we can obviously work with communities for those, not just related to cultural, but other resource impacts that we can engage on.
Jeff or Rob, you want to comment there?
Eric, I just wanted a little clarification. Were you referring to construction related situations or really more the upfront type studies, things like that?
It could be either, Rob.
Okay. Eric and I, we have the luxury of sharing a lot of information on certain threatened and endangered species with New Jersey Audubon or other NGOs that have a particular concern over a certain species. So that's, generally we don't, from an environmental perspective, I think, at least I could speak for us, we're upfront about anything we find to the parties that are relevant to that either species or location or special resource. I would hope that we've been transparent and will be in the future. So anything that we can share, I can speak for me, we're going to share.
Yeah, I would echo Rob's comments there. And obviously, when we are making filings, we're including as much technical data as we can to support our applications. And in most cases, that information is going to be made available to the public. The other thing to consider is if we're making observations, let's say about protected species, there's a few ways that we would be reporting that information through appropriate channels, and that in some ways would be reported through a hotline, or it could be reported through a report that's filed with the agency when the activity's done. So that information is available to the public after it's been filed with the agency.
Thank you, Jeff. Other questions amongst panelists? Just pause here. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Kira. So this is probably primarily for Megan, and as the BPU and DEP evaluate the SAA process, how much of that evaluation is going to look to the future? As we talked today, I know the goal of the governor is to achieve 7,500 megawatts, bringing power onshore. Is there value at actually moving forward with larger capability if the footprint is small? Is there an evaluation in that aspect? Thank you.
I'll start and kind of take a little bit of this one, but I think it's more appropriate for my colleagues at BPU. I'll say that, you know, some of the proposals that we saw preliminarily may have kind of included considerations for the future and for building out in the future. And so while that's a great idea, I think, and a good approach to planning, you know, from a permitting perspective, there may be some issues in doing that if, you know, it depends on the federal process, and kind of the scope of a project that we could permit would have to be an approved project, something that is able to move forward and be approved by the federal government. So there's kind of that little bit of perhaps, you know, something that we need to think about more and look more at in the future. But it certainly is possible, and I think it's good to consider here. But I'm not really sure what BPU is thinking around that as far as evaluating the proposals.
I think primarily today we're in listening mode, so we'll be collecting all the comments, including yours, Michael, and consider them during our evaluation process. Any other questions amongst panelists before we turn to closing remarks? I think I'll probably go in the order that you spoke originally. Okay, go ahead, Captain Paul.
I have a question for, I guess, Megan and Josh. I'm wondering if there's any kind of cooperative research opportunities here while we have this fleet of vessels out there. I know that state of New Jersey is always looking for more data on certain things. And this presents an opportunity. If we're going to be bottom mapping and surveying and doing all this, there should be scientists in the DEP that could consider this potentially an opportunity to discover some things about our coast.
I think that's a great point, Paul. And something that we are considering, and we are actually implementing now with the leaseholders, offshore wind leaseholders off the coast of New Jersey, who are doing similar work at the same time. And so we have been just having a lot of discussions with them around, you know, monitoring and doing things consistently so that we have consistent data and controls, and we can, as Eric has mentioned, you know, use that data in informing some of our decisions moving forward. So definitely trying to coordinate both off the coast of New Jersey and then regionally as well. So yes, very good point. And we are hoping to do that in the future with many of the developers, even the ones that just received or were the winning bidders in the recent lease auction. So these are all things that we're considering and planning to do moving forward.
Okay, and secondly, if I may take another pass, it might include Josh as well. I'm just wondering if there are opportunities to hire local charter vessels and or local mariners as security vessels and or marine mammal observing vessels while this work is taking place.
Yeah, from actually, yeah, I think there certainly could be, oftentimes, if there's an activity proposed, whether it's survey work that has the potential to require an IHA from NOAA, for example, as you mentioned, the PSOs are on board ships, and so where they're being, there certainly could be opportunities that arise from those PSO requirements. And then I just wanted to go back also that BOEM does commission a number of studies, often that are suggested by stakeholders and the public, and we do sort of an annual solicitation for studies that are required. And so our website, our studies page lays out sort of what's ongoing, what's been completed, and every now and then we have that public solicitation to suggest things that are needed. So could be another opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to give our panelists a very brief opportunity for any closing remarks you'd like to make, and we'll go in the order that you gave your presentation. So Josh, if you'd like to say anything in conclusion, please do so now.
Sure. First, thank you for putting this together. I think it's been really helpful, and looking forward to all of the coordination going forward that any of these projects will require, and happy to work with everyone here and continue the conversation as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Megan?
Thanks, Kira. Yep, thank you to BPU and also my fellow panelists. It's been a great conversation so far. And I'll just reiterate, DEP's commitment to not only doing critical work to address climate change, but also protecting natural resources as we work to achieve our state's offshore wind goals. So looking forward to being involved, continuing to be involved in reviewing these proposals and working with BPU as they consider transmission solutions.
Thank you, Megan. Michael.
Thank you, Kira. And I want to thank also my fellow panelists. I want to also applaud BPU for pursuing the SAA process. Candidly, I think it's already demonstrated that we can minimize impacts to the environment while bringing that essential renewable energy from wind energy on the shore of New Jersey. I also like the concept that it's going to save ratepayers money by doing so. And that's a key fundamental that I know we all greatly appreciate. But what we didn't talk about today, and I do want to remind everyone, is I think this process also reduces regulatory risk by establishing a clear, minimized project footprint that delivers the obligations and the goals of the governor. You're going to minimize that regulatory risk and get more wind energy into New Jersey faster. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Michael. Rob? Sorry, I think Jeff is next, then Rob. My apologies, Jeff.
That's okay, no problem. Well, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists and the BPU and PJM for this process and the opportunity to participate. I see well over 100 people have attended today, and really thank them for their time and attention, because this is an important process, and it's going to lead to really great things for New Jersey and the United States. MAOD is being careful and diligent about a proposal that is going to help advance the offshore wind industry and to help New Jersey meet its renewable energy goals now and into the future. MAOD is going to provide a transmission service on an open access basis, and is offering the flexibility with respect to the location of offshore HVDC platforms and bringing power ashore in a very effective, efficient way with low impact. So again, thank you for your time, and I invite you to review the information provided in our environmental protection plan and our fisheries protection plan, where even more information is articulated about MAOD's commitment to sustainable growth of this industry while protecting New Jersey's marine environment.
Thank you, Jeff. Rob.
I just want to say also thanks to the BPU and staff for putting this together. I think it's pretty clear that our partnership with Ørsted is committed to the state of New Jersey. We've been doing business here since 1903, well over 100 years. New Jersey is our home. It's where we live, it's where we play, and we're committed to doing the right thing for the state and its environment. I think that's it.
Thank you, Rob. Captain Paul.
I guess I just want to reiterate that fishermen should support responsible offshore wind development, and this end of the project makes it much more environmentally and fish friendly, if you will. And I think that maritime as well as fishing interests need to engage. They need to be encouraged to engage more often. They are at the table, but I don't believe that there is widespread participation at this time, especially with recreational fishermen. I think it's a win-win. You know, if we can nip climate change and accomplish this at the same time responsibly in respect of nature first, not business, we'll all be on the right side of history here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Eric, you get the last word here.
Thank you. Thanks to BPU and the fellow panelists for today's discussion. Again, clearly the SSA, you are following the mantra of avoid, then minimize, then finally mitigate. I would suggest that when we get mitigation, that however that is calculated, figure out the how first, not the dollar value. How you put a monetary figure on whatever the impacts are. Develop that framework. That framework should also be public. Finally, I would stress, choose an organization or organizations with a proven track record. We had to have chimney work done. I hired someone that came recommended from 2 people that I know and trust. So when you select this company, the who is incredibly important. What is their track record with the agencies? What is the track record with both environmental, natural resources and environmental justice within the state? What is their commitment to the state of New Jersey? And then finally, this is not on the applicants, but on BPU and DEP. Ask, well, I appreciate that these reports on findings during an application are available to kind of technocrats. When I talk about easily accessible data, figure out a portal that really provides that front and center, where you don't have to have an in-depth detailed knowledge of the inner workings of an agency to find the information. You all are already leading in this space, continue to lead. Thank you for your commitment to making New Jersey a little bit less underwater than it would otherwise be, and looking out for both our natural resources and our residents.
Thank you, Eric. And I want to close by saying thank you to all of our panelists for this really insightful discussion. We really appreciate your participation. At this point, we're going to segue to our stakeholder comment portion. And I'm going to turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Tina, who will be conducting this portion of the meeting. So I'll let her take it from here. And panelists, if you can mute your mics and shut off your videos, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tina Notaro. I'm the board's communications manager. And for this meeting, we had a pre-registered speakers list. So first we will move through that list. And then if you would still like to make comments but did not pre-register, at the end of our pre-registered speakers, you'll be able to raise your hand and we'll call on you then. If you're joining by phone, to raise your hand, you'll have to press *9 so that we can see that you'd like to comment today. So our first speakers that we have on our list are Zachary Klein and Becky Walding. So Zachary, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi there. Yeah, sorry about that. Just very briefly wanted to emphasize the concerns of Clean Ocean Action, who I'm here representing today, about the environmental impacts of these projects. There was a comment, or I should say a question that I left that frankly I thought was relevant, although it was ultimately rejected. And that question was, given the current data gaps and the seriousness of the risks at play, it seems more responsible to start with a pilot scale offshore wind development in the mid-Atlantic to minimize the impacts of bringing energy onshore while we figure out how to do so most responsibly in greater volume. There was a lot of talk today about a lack of data, about uncertainty, about both the impacts in general and the future of these projects. And So I just, urge that the approach to minimizing these impacts not be looked at so rigidly, and that if necessary or appropriate, we take a step back and consider that maybe reducing or not jumping to rapid industrial development might help ensure that this interconnection with the grid can be done in the most responsible way possible. So that's my only comment at this time. Thanks for offering this opportunity.
We had a few names on our pre-registered speakers list that don't appear to be inside the Zoom meeting, so I'll call on your names, and if you're here and just not logged in under that name, just raise your hand and we'll call on you later on. It's Becky Walding, James Ware, David Wallace, Natalie Junot. If any of these pre-registered speakers are on the call, please just raise your hand. I don't see them logged into the meeting, so I'll move on to our next speakers that are here, which are Scott Mackey, and after Scott will be Richard Bursch. So Scott, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. This is Scott Mackey on behalf of the Garden State Seafood Association. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to provide some comments regarding the SSA as it relates to transmission and environmental impacts. We are greatly concerned about the impact of transmission. We support minimizing the number of cables in the greatest possible way to minimize the impact on commercial fishing, most of which is done via bottom trawl, mid-water trawl, pulling large structures through this environment. While I understand, and I can understand why Mr. Eidelman would support these projects because they provide a lot of structure out there, the commercial fishing industry has issues with all of that structure. And from a cumulative approach, it has even a greater impact on our industry. And while we talk about global warming, and I don't deny that global warming is an issue and my industry sees it every day, we are greatly concerned with the size, scope, and cumulative effects of such huge projects in such a short period of time being proposed off our coast in prime fishing grounds. And anything we can do to make sure that we minimize the environmental impacts on the cold pool and on our ecosystem must be done. And it should have been done before we even got to this point. It's disappointing that we continue to move forward with these projects, but we don't have things like transmission for all of the projects easily identified. I give the BPU and the PJM and the DEP credit for trying to play catch up with this issue, but this is just one example of something that was foreseeable that should have been addressed prior to this state of the process. Because now we have two existing leases that won't be included in this project. And they could have been, and that would have been minimized on the ratepayer and minimized on our environment. We will provide additional comments. And again, we appreciate this opportunity to provide some input today. Thank you.
Up next, we have Richard Bursch and then Joe Wagner. Richard, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, the opportunity. I'm going to talk about the EMFs and the cable lines. They've been proven to be a source of cancer, including childhood leukemia. And that's the reason the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts has filed a lawsuit to prohibit the cable lines running through the residential streets. That's one point. Another article on NewJersey.com stated that many of the environmental groups have sued the governor and his lack of moving forward on their concerns. The article mentioned that they have concerns of the cable lines running through the pinelands, and I support that. But what's strange is that they support the offshore wind projects and the cable lines going through Ocean City. And thirdly, regarding the EMFs, in the Ocean City Centennial article of April 14th, 2021, titled 20 Questions for Ørsted, the Ocean Wind Limited Liability Company's project development director, when asked about the studies on the effects of the EMF impact, said, quote, "It's reasonably not possible to conduct those studies on existing impacts before it's done, unquote. That's to say, we'll study them after they're in the ground. The Senate bill passed and signed into law provides you, the BPU, with the ability to override local municipality home rule in the decision-making process and where the cable lines will be placed. Within that Senate Bill S 3926, Section 3G, the very last paragraph and line is the following regarding the placement of cables. And number 2, that no alternative site is reasonably available to achieve equivalent public benefit. So taking consideration the Falmouth's lawsuit, environmental groups' concerns on cable lines for the Pinelands, along with Ørsted's own statements, why would the BPU even consider taking any risk whatsoever with EMF emitting cable lines running up a crowded beach where nearly sand is replaced almost every year because it's been washed away, has been then running them under the lines under a Green Acres site on residential streets, as there are thousands of people that use that beach in the summer, along with weekly turnover of visitors. And in that Green Acres site, kids, there's a playground and there's tennis courts. And remember the failure of those cable lines of a Block Island that popped up, and I don't know if they replaced them yet, but they've fixed them, but they haven't happened. In fact, I heard in this presentation today from Ørsted that they work with local folks and avoid Green Acres. Yet that's not true. As proven by their Ocean City, by their Green Acres deviation request and the support for that Senate Bill 8936. So regardless of how low the cancer risk is, it is a health risk. And as the law states, sites should be used if available. In fact, in Ocean City, there's 2. One at the north end at Egg Harbor Inlet, and the other much closer to Beasley's Point at Corson's Inlet. The BPU should not allow your decision of where to put these cable lines dictated by what is in the best financial interest of foreign developers, as you are our New Jersey government agency and have the mission to be putting the health of its residents foremost. Now, there's just 2 quick other concerns, if I may. Birds. You know, I love the work the Audubon Society does. I'm my local presenter today. But I don't know how you can substantiate with 100% confidence your support for the wind turbines as they are currently proposed. We know the statement, more birds die from large building collisions than windmills. However, there are a heck of a lot more buildings than windmills. In fact, there's no 1,000 tall wind turbines with 700-foot blade circumferences. More so, that's like a 100-story building with 70 stories wide. So I don't know where you have that evidence for support, but not one, but hundreds and hundreds of these are going to be located off the coast. I believe your concerns better off in reducing climate change should be concentrated on other renewable sources such as solar, geothermal, hydro, wave energy, and other reduced carbon footprint choices that do not pose a potential threat to wildlife. And I'll just end up with this on marine life. Last week, many of you probably were on this Rutgers webinar on the North Atlantic right whale with the industrialization of the ocean, in which Mark Baumgarten of Woods Hole, probably considered by many as the foremost expert on the North Atlantic right whale, was a presenter. And Dr. Baumgarten did a great job outlining the threats to the whale. And he supports offshore wind and their effects he initiated. Every time he spoke about his support, he started his statements with, "I think." And when speaking about what the developers are doing, started his statements with, "if they." To me, that's concerning. As a scientist with such credentials would use those terms. Keeping in mind that scientists are guided by cynicism. So that poses the question that without 100% New York Bight studies completed, that's New York Bight, not North Atlantic Ocean studies, why are we fast tracking the development of what could potentially be destructive and irreversible to both the ecosystem and marine life and livelihoods? We should not move on with 100% confidence. So thank you for the opportunity to allowing stakeholders to finally address the BPU. And please be 100% sure that you're doing the right thing, waiting for and utilizing completed science-based studies done in our waters and allowing so many turbines so quickly without a sampling to study. As many people have stated here, we should have a sample. Thank you so much.
Up next, we had Joe Wagner, who I don't see logged into the Zoom webinar. So I'll call on Suzanne Hornick first, and then after Suzanne will be Greg Kudnick. So Suzanne, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me begin by saying that first of all, I represent Protect Our Coast NJ, and I am absolutely against offshore wind, while recognizing that we still need to do something about the climate change that is very real. It's disgusting to me that our New Jersey Assembly and Senate were willing to write new laws taking away our rights at the request of offshore wind industry without meaningful comment in just a few days, once it was known that local stakeholders opposed this plan. That's un-American and a complete abuse of power. The BPU's mission statement is to, and I quote, to ensure that safe, adequate, and proper utility services are provided at reasonable, non-discriminatory rates to all members of the public who desire such services, to develop and regulate a competitive, economically cost-effective energy policy that promotes responsible growth and clean renewable energy sources while maintaining a high quality of life in New Jersey. This plan doesn't do any of that. Moreover, according to the criteria on the DEP's website for the New Jersey Green Acres program, this project doesn't meet the criteria to take away pre-existing Green Acres grants, land grants.
Ms.
So,
Hornick, I'm so
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. This is Andrea Hart with the BPU. I can certainly hear you're passionate about the offshore wind projects. It sounds like you are addressing or referencing an existing offshore wind project. And I just want to refocus our attention to the issue at hand, which is for the state agreement approach, which is a proposed coordinated transmission for future offshore wind generation projects.
I get
so
that.
I didn't know if
getting
you had
around to
any.
it.
Okay, great.
Yes,
Thank
I'm getting
you.
to it. However, as I stated in my written comments on the chat, I believe the BPU really needs to have a conversation with the actual stakeholders who are the people who live, work, play, and visit these communities in the coastal areas. Anyway, the cable bundles that are proposed, as well as the turbines, are not safe. They emit EMFs, have links to several types of cancers, miscarriages, dementias. Nobody is studying the cumulative effects of the additional radiation emitted by these cables, along with the 4 and 5G nodes and other utilities that are up and down our coast. You're talking about 1,000 gigantic turbines, over 1,050 feet tall, 750 feet wide each. They are experimental. They have never been built before. We don't know how they're going to react. And I got to tell you, Ocean City is, at least my group is very resentful. We are not the BPU's guinea pigs. So the rates for the electricity is going to push our bills significantly higher. That is not in the BPU's mission statement. It's not green, it's not clean. I think it's ignorant and irresponsible of the president of the New Jersey Audubon Society to suggest that it's a red herring to say China and India, that what China and India do to climate change won't negate what New Jersey does. That's just ridiculous. Yes, we have a responsibility, but no matter what we do in New Jersey, it's not going to solve climate change. And I have yet to find, and I've been studying this and all the documentation for 3 years now, I cannot find anything that says that, yes, we know that it's going to be 5 times or more expensive, but we think that it's going to stop climate change this much or this percentage by certain dates and times. You know, it's not. And that it's ridiculous to insinuate that it is. It's disingenuous. Okay, now we as coastal residents and from Protect Our Coast NJ demand that extensive scientific local environmental impact studies be done prior to anything being put in the sea or the land. That's not currently what's happening, and we're being told that you're going to study it after the fact. In fact, the EPA told me when I called the office that after these EMF emitting cables are laid across the land, the EPA will then come in and measure the allowable level or the level of emitted EMFs, and they will then determine whether or not it's within allowable limits. Are you kidding me? That's just not okay with me. I had several questions regarding today's presentation. The captain, whatever, Paul said that these things are, the monopiles will create great reefs for our fish. Well, it's my understanding that the predominant ocean dwellers that we have here, fish-wise, are bottom dwellers, not reef dwellers. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Comparing this project to Block Island, just so people understand, Block Island has 5 little teeny wind turbines. They're nowhere near the size that is proposed for these projects, particularly Atlantic Shores. And for the last year, 4 of the 5 have not been working. My other concern is that the BPU is saying that there will be great fishing around these monopiles, and that, you know, the fish are going to be, or the fishermen will be allowed to be there. But how is that going to be possible if these wind farms are being monitored by helicopter and by boat most of the time? Also, what happens when one of these turbines throws a 350-foot blade? Because that does happen. You know, how many boats are going to have to be sunk and catastrophes happen before we recognize that boats can't be in that area?
We're right off that lady.
Okay, at this point,
Excuse me, I'm still speaking.
I understand.
That was
but
kind of rude.
I'm so.
I have more questions about today's.
I'm sorry.
thing.
At this point, we just are going to take a pause for a minute because
that was not me cursing. That was somebody else. That's.
I understand. Let me just take a minute and then we'll come back to you, Suzanne. I'm going to take a pause and we're going to put everyone on mute.
Some guy just started cursing. I don't know. It wasn't me. I'm not repeating it. I'm just trying to make my questions clear.
Okay, this is Andrea. Susan, we'll continue. I do want to let all stakeholders and attendees today know that we are here to listen and to respectfully engage and respectfully hear the concerns. We will not be tolerating any additional outbursts. We understand, Suzanne, it wasn't you. So we do want to hear. I will ask that moving forward, we keep our comments somewhat succinct, as I know we have a lot of commenters here. Suzanne, I'll let you finish up and provide some closing remarks, but I will ask that all others remain muted. And if again, we hear another outburst, I'll pause the meeting again and we'll figure out a civil way to move forward. So Suzanne, the floor is yours again.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. That was not me, just so everybody knows I don't speak like that. So I talked about Block Island. I would like to, I don't understand why the myriad of fishermen who are very much against this project were not also able to be on here. Why are you just having one ship captain who supports the plan? Because there's a lot of really valid information in the fishing industry about why this is a bad plan. I'd like to know exactly what climate change benefit we will see from the New Jersey offshore wind program and how fast it's going to happen. Let's see. And I had one other question and I can't find it. So I do appreciate all the presenters' time. I found the New Jersey Audubon president incredibly offensive and completely disregarding of anybody else's opinion. I personally have rescinded my membership from the Audubon Society and will never give them another dime because I know they took a great deal of money from Ørsted. So that negates a lot of what they say and do because they're no longer independent. However, the one thing nobody is asking is the question that I was interrupted when I asked the first time, and that is what happens? Are the fishermen actually really going to be allowed to be at the base of these things? And what happens when one of them, one of the thousands, throws a 750 blade at however many miles an hour? That's a problem. So that's all. And I appreciate you letting me speak.
All right, thank you, Tina. Who's next up?
Up next, we have Greg Kudnick, and then we did have Robin Schaefer pre-registered to speak, although I don't see Robin on the Zoom, so I'll call on Greg. And after Greg, anyone who would like to speak will be able to raise their hand. Greg, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Greg Kudnick, recreational fisherman, 100-ton masters captain at a Barnegat Light. Also run a family business, Fisherman's Headquarters, retail bait and tackle shop. So there's obviously lots of stuff to talk about, but you guys want to stay within the scope of this meeting. So I'll kind of keep it focused to that if possible. Definitely like to request the NJBPU makes say some time for more public meetings, more broad scoped public meetings, just to kind of hear. I heard earlier in this meeting about the from many different experts or people that are involved in this, that everything's doing a collaborative approach. And it just, to me, it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, yeah, there's some collaboration, but I talk with my own people here in the local area of fishing clubs, some of the oldest fishing clubs actually in the country. So they're well established. These aren't run by night, little 2-person clubs. And they don't even know what's going on. So I'll leave that at that and move on and just say that I do totally agree with the Garden State Seafood, Clean Ocean Action, Rich Birch, and Protect Our Coast. I think there was some really valid comments from all of those different parties. So once again, I really appreciate all those people. Something that really just bothers me is development is fully outpacing the science. And I just make up that saying that comes from scientists at Rutgers. And I know they're doing lots of work on this, and that's great to see. I just don't see why there's a ton of money being spent on research and development is not slated till after that research is done. Just seems like there's kind of a flip-flop in terms of the priorities, and that rapid advancement in construction just very, very concerning to potentially harm and ruin the marine ecosystem, which I personally depend on, and a lot of my colleagues and people in the local recreational and commercial fishing industry and local communities here on the Jersey Shore depend on. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to hopefully having some more public meetings where we can discuss some broader scope than just say some of these cablings and some of these specific parts. I really don't want to speak in favor of anything because I'm not in favor of any part of the project as a whole. So thank you.
We have gotten to the end of our pre-registered speakers list. So if you would like to make public comments during the meeting, now would be the time to raise your hand through Zoom. That's located at the bottom of your screen. There's an icon to raise your hand. If you're calling in by phone, you can do that. You can raise your hand by pressing *9. So we will call on people as they raise their hands. First is Robin Schaefer. You should be able to unmute yourself, Robin.
Unmute. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Robin Schaefer. I'm in the north end of Ocean City, New Jersey. And I'm right off the bat, I got to say, I've always been a proponent of renewable energy. I own a solar installation down in Maryland, and love the idea of it. There are a few concerns that I've raised. I had to drop off the call for a little bit, so I don't know if this was previously discussed or any of the questions that I brought up were asked. But the issue of equity in where these transmission lines are going to be fed, it kept coming up, and I'm concerned that there is an effort by, I believe his name is Mr. Stiles, to correct historical wrongs by, the fact that transmission cables have gone through poorer neighborhoods, that we're going to somehow correct that by putting transmission cables and causing harm to waterfront communities, our beautiful seashore communities along the Jersey Shore. I don't believe that should ever be a goal for a renewable energy project. I believe a renewable energy project should benefit all. It shouldn't be inconsiderate to the views of the people, or inconvenient or cost more for the residents of a particular area. I think that the problem, as I see it, is that this is being kind of jammed down the throats of the people that live along the Jersey Shore, and without their buy-in. And I'm just very concerned that this is not the way you go about introducing renewable energy projects to a large population. So I thank you for your time, and I certainly hope that this project does not move forward as it's been drawn up. So thank you.
Next, we'll have Rachel Dawn Davis.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, my name is Rachel Dawn Davis, and I am the Public Policy and Justice Organizer for Water Spirit, which is the Ministry of Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. And we represent thousands of members throughout the state, and our nonpartisan nonprofit was inspired by the beauty of the Jersey Shore and the Delaware River tributaries. We also had property on the Jersey Shore, but was lost due to Superstorm Sandy. I appreciate the opportunity to share comments today, and we'll share others thereafter regarding environmental impacts. We do hope the BPU focuses solely on renewable energy going forward in all ways, shapes, and forms, and specifically with respect to this conversation. As many have stated before, BPU, PJM, and NJDEP should focus on better clarifying and expanding stakeholder engagement, especially at the local levels. We should be focusing on renewable energy responsibly. We are concerned about biodiversity, health concerns, and are glad to be hearing calls for easily digestible data for those who do not have technical backgrounds. When we think about energy costs, we should understand that the lowest rate is not necessarily the least cost to consumers. There are already cumulative impacts intergenerationally in regions throughout New Jersey because of fossil fuel and other polluting industries that continue, again, cumulatively across generations to pollute their lungs and cause cancer. And it is not okay for any child to engage in having a preventable disease. So I appreciate the opportunity again to make comments, and wholeheartedly agree that we should focus on renewable energy in a responsible way for all the future of our survival, frankly. Thank you.
Up next is Theodore Paradise.
Thanks so much. And I'm Theodore Paradise with Amberic Development Partners, and really appreciate the comments of the panelists earlier today, highlighting the benefits of the approach that New Jersey's taken. And just listening to some of the discussion, I hear some discussion of concern about going too fast. And we've done studies out there that I just wanted to highlight of the way offshore wind started to be developed in the US was with, as people discussed on the panel, a line from each project. And the studies both here and in Europe show that the approach that New Jersey's taking can reduce these cables, this undersea trenching, by over 50%. It can reduce the overall number of facilities even greater, and the ratepayer savings are in the billions of dollars as facilities are avoided in terms of the number of facilities and types used. And then, of course, there's incredible savings as offshore wind scales, because we're avoiding really costly fuels through winter periods, especially like natural gas, which can add incredible costs over just a few week cold snap period. I did just want to highlight too, because I know, it's a complicated industry and people hear about transmission lines and EMF. A lot of the proposals that were talked about today use something called HVDC, or high voltage direct current. And that's different than alternating current. And I wanted to just note that because HVDC is a cable technology that, as some of the panelists noted, you can fit a lot more power through one cable versus AC cables, which it's about one cable for every 400 megawatts. But the EMF that people have talked about is really very, very low with HVDC. In fact, the static magnetic fields of HVDC are a little lower than the Earth's background magnetic energy. It's a very, very, very low EMF signature. And that's one of the reasons that EMF is a great technology in addition to avoiding as many cables as alternatives. Different folks have different views about EMF, but HVDC is a technology approach that just really helps, I think, the discussion by avoiding that concern altogether. So I did just want to highlight that and note that a lot of the projects that have been proposed into the state agreement approach is using that HVDC technology. Thanks so much.
If anyone else would like to make a public comment, now is the time to raise your hand through Zoom. Again, if you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. If you're on a desktop, the raise hand button's at the bottom of your screen. If no one else will raise their hand, I'm going to pass the meeting back over to Andrea.
Thanks, Kira. I'll give it, I'm sorry, Tina. I'll give it another 30 seconds just to give ample time for folks to raise their hand. Okay, having seen none, I'll start my closing statements by thanking everyone for your participation in today's meeting. I want to thank again the panelists for their presentations. I also want to thank BPU staff, our attorney generals, our consultant Brattle, and a special thank you to the PJM team for their incredible efforts. I do want to know, I truly appreciate the passion and participation for today's meeting. I want to remind attendees that the board will only tolerate respectful discourse. So I think the attendees here today are some of the most interested in these issues and positioned to continue this conversation. But I will ask that collectively we work towards ensuring that we're always engaging respectfully despite our differences in views. So with that, today's meeting is an important part of the board's evaluation process of the SAA proposals, as public engagement and transparency is a pillar in the board's efforts. So I want to thank the stakeholders for speaking and listening today. I want to thank the board and PJM's actions towards initiating the inaugural SAA solicitation. Under the SAA, I'll remind listeners that the BPU is the ultimate decision maker, deciding which, if any, of the proposals proceed to construction. These projects are not likely to be pursued if they don't result in the development of a lower cost, lower risk, or higher benefit option for the interconnection and delivery of New Jersey's offshore wind. As previously mentioned, the recording of this meeting will be available on the board's website, as will all presentations. As a reminder, there will be one more stakeholder meeting following this, focusing on ratepayer protections and cost controls. The board is also accepting written and electronic comments. While all comments will be given equal consideration and will be made part of the final record, the preferred method of transmittal is via the board's external access portal after obtaining a My New Jersey portal ID. Detailed instructions for e-filing can be found at the board's homepage at www.nj.gov/bpu/agenda/e-filing. Emailed comments may be filed with the Secretary of the Board in PDF or Word format to board.secretary@bpu.nj.gov. Written comments may also be submitted to the Board Secretary at the Board of Public Utilities, 44 South Clinton Avenue, first floor, P.O. Box 350, Trenton, New Jersey, 08625-0350. All comments should include the name of the matter and the docket number. As a final reminder, all comments are considered public documents for purposes of the state's Open Public Records Act. Please identify any information that you seek to keep confidential by submitting such in accordance with the confidentiality procedures set forth in NJAC 14:1-12.3. Again, thank you all for your attendance and participation today. And with that, I'll conclude the meeting.